Before Nebuchadnezzar left his mark on history, the region he would come to rule was going through one of the most unstable and transformative periods of antiquity. Mesopotamia, a Greek name meaning land between rivers, located between the Tigris and Euphrates, was a landscape of ever-shifting civilizations, where cities rose and fell, empires were built on the ruins of others, and time seemed to revolve around war, commerce, and religion. Since the era of the Sumerians, who invented writing and built ziggurats, to the Akkadians, who first unified the city-states under the command of Sargon, this land had been a stage of both grandeur and collapse. When the Assyrians dominated the north with brutal military force, the south, where Babylon was emerging, oscillated between submission and rebellion. Babylon already existed, but it was just one among many cities with no particular prominence, until the rise of a new leadership that would change everything. Ancient Babylon began as a small city in Sumer, growing slowly under the shadow of more powerful rivals like Ur, Lagash, and Uruk. It was only with Hammurabi in the 18th century before Christ that the city gained prominence as the capital of an empire. Hammurabi unified the region and left behind the famous Code of Laws, now a symbol of ancient justice. However, after his death, the city endured centuries of decline and invasions, being conquered by Kassites, Elamites, and later absorbed by larger empires such as the Assyrian. Throughout this cycle of splendor and obscurity, the city remained an important cultural and religious center, with the Temple of Marduk, its patron god, preserved even during foreign domination. Babylon was like a jewel buried beneath the sands of time, waiting for someone to restore its brilliance. That someone began to emerge amidst the chaos of the 7th century before Christ. The Assyrian Empire, once dominant, began to show signs of weakness. Its armies were feared, but the empire was weighed down by internal revolts and relentless wars. The cities under its control, including Babylon itself, harbored deep resentment. It was in this climate that Nabopolassar rose, a Chaldean general of obscure origins who rebelled against the Assyrians and achieved the impossible, freeing Babylon from centuries of subjugation. Through bold strategy and clever political alliances, he defeated the Assyrians and founded the so-called Neo-Babylonian Empire, ushering in a new era for the city and setting the stage for his son, Nebuchadnezzar, to become one of the most powerful figures in ancient history. With Nabopolassar's rise, Babylon began to shine once more. Temples were restored, the city walls were reinforced, and priests regained influence over state affairs. The name Babylon once again inspired fear and respect among neighboring lands. Nabopolassar knew that to preserve his achievement, he needed a worthy successor, and he invested in the military, diplomatic, and religious education of his heir. It was in this context that Nebuchadnezzar grew up, within a budding empire forged from the ashes of Assyrian rule and fueled by a promise of glory. The dawn of a new empire was not just beginning, it was radiating powerfully, and at its core was the name Babylon, now destined for greatness with a new king, a new face, and an extraordinary future. The story of Nebuchadnezzar can only be understood in the light of this Mesopotamian dawn, where kingdoms were unstable, gods demanded constant reverence, and men needed more than ambition to leave their mark. They needed vision. This vision, once dreamed by Hammurabi and glimpsed by Nabopolassar, would find its ultimate form in the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon, once just another city, was about to become the beating heart of the ancient world. To understand the power and glory that Nebuchadnezzar achieved, it is essential to turn our eyes to the figure of his father, Nabopolassar, the true founder of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He was not born into royalty, nor did he inherit any crown. On the contrary, he rose as a Chaldean commander in the midst of the political and military upheaval of 7th century before Christ Mesopotamia, at a time when the Assyrian Empire, though still powerful, was beginning to crumble from within. Nabopolassar did not merely see the opportunity to free Babylon from Assyrian rule. He crafted a military, diplomatic, and symbolic strategy to place the city once again at the center of the known world. His rise was more than a territorial conquest. It was the creation of a new imperial identity. For centuries, the Assyrians had ruled Mesopotamia with an iron fist. Their campaigns were violent, their punishments exemplary, and their armies feared by all. When Babylon rebelled, it was crushed with brutality. But starting with the reign of the last great Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, the empire began to show fractures. Distant provinces grew restless, and civil wars between rival claimants drained Assyria's resources and stability. It was in this atmosphere of tension that Nabopolassar emerged as the leader of a Chaldean revolt in the south. Rather than launching a direct attack, he consolidated support among subjugated peoples, secured control over Babylon, and gradually expanded his domain, weakening the Assyrians from the fringes before striking at the empire's heart. Nabopolassar was a patient strategist. His goal was not merely Babylonian independence, but the complete replacement of the Assyrian Empire. He allied with the Medes, an Iranian people also eager to see the Assyrians fall. This alliance proved decisive. Together, Babylonians and Medes began a systematic campaign to destroy the Assyrian strongholds. Between the years 614 and 610 before Christ, the major Assyrian cities were destroyed one by one. Assur fell in 614, Nineveh, the symbolic and administrative capital, was obliterated in 612, and finally in 609, the last Assyrian resistance was crushed. What had once seemed impossible in the face of Assyrian military might become a reality. The most feared empire of the ancient world had been annihilated, and Babylon re-emerged as the dominant power. Nabopolassar's victory was not only military, he legitimized his rule through Babylonian religiosity, restoring temples, supporting the priesthood, and reinforcing the cult of Marduk. The narrative of liberation took on sacred tones, as if Babylon had been chosen by the gods to restore cosmic order after Assyrian arrogance. At the same time, he rebuilt infrastructure, organized administration, and ensured a smooth transition from military dominance to civil governance. The people did not merely accept his rule, they celebrated it as a rebirth. For the first time in centuries, the Babylonians had a strong, legitimate king, born among them and committed to rebuilding national pride. It was in this climate of growing glory that a young Nebuchadnezzar began to distinguish himself as a military commander under his father's guidance. While Nabopolassar solidified his control over Babylon, he sent his son to lead key campaigns in the west, especially against the Egyptians who sought to fill the void left by Assyria's fall. The king's confidence in his son was so great that even before his death, he was already preparing him as the absolute successor. When Nabopolassar died in 605 before Christ, Nebuchadnezzar had already proven himself in battle and returned to Babylon as the natural heir to the throne, not only by blood but by merit. The story of Nabopolassar is thus inseparable from the greatness of his son. Without him, Babylon might never have emerged from Assyria's shadow. Without his vision, strategy, and determination, the name Nebuchadnezzar might have been lost in the sands of history. By overthrowing the Assyrians, restoring Babylonian faith, and laying the foundations of an empire, Nabopolassar handed his son not merely a crown, but a grand destiny to fulfill. And that destiny, as we will see, would be marked by epic wars, colossal constructions, and spiritual conflicts that would echo through the centuries. The figure history consecrated as Nebuchadnezzar, King of Kings, was born during a time of instability and transition, but grew up surrounded by symbols of power, ambition, and imperial destiny. As the son of the newly proclaimed King Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar did not experience a childhood marked by the passive luxury of traditional courts. On the contrary, from a very early age he was raised to lead, govern, and wage war, absorbing the values of the Chaldeans, the faith of the Babylonians, and the harsh realities of Mesopotamian politics. There are no detailed records of his childhood as we understand them today, but historical clues, Babylonian accounts, and biblical and archaeological interpretations allow us to reconstruct the formation of this prince with almost cinematic clarity, a young man molded by duty and destiny, whose life would be inseparable from his father's imperial project. Nebuchadnezzar was born around 634 before Christ, likely in Babylon itself, or in one of the Chaldean strongholds already under his father's control in southern Mesopotamia. From an early age, he was immersed in the routines of court and army life. Alongside priests, he learned to read and interpret the signs of the heavens, sacred texts, and the administrative practices of Babylonian bureaucracy. Literacy was a rare privilege, reserved for the priestly elite and future rulers, and Nebuchadnezzar distinguished himself in this world. But his education went far beyond cuneiform writing or offerings to Marduk. His father made a point of involving him in the practical affairs of the growing empire. From adolescence, he accompanied military campaigns, studied maps and strategies, and directly witnessed the conditions of conquered peoples, developing a calculating mind, disciplined character, and a deep understanding of the art of command. Nebuchadnezzar's youth was marked by real challenges. While his father consolidated control over Babylon and forged alliances with the Medes, the young prince was sent to frontier regions where he led troops, negotiated with local leaders, and established military outposts. One of his first major campaigns was against the Egyptians, who were advancing through the Levant in an attempt to occupy the former Assyrian territories. Even then, Nebuchadnezzar showed the traits that would define him throughout life: strategic coldness, adaptability, and a deep pride in his mission. He was not merely the king's son. He was the chosen one to ensure that Babylon would never fall back into obscurity. And that weight, rather than crushing him, shaped him like iron in fire. Beyond military training, his religious formation played a vital role. The Babylonians believed the king to be the intermediary between gods and men. Thus Nebuchadnezzar was prepared for the most sacred rituals, for the ceremonies of Marduk's temple, and for the New Year festivals, during which the king was required to humble himself before the supreme deity to renew the covenant with the heavens. These rituals demanded deep knowledge of myths, astrology, lunar calendars, and offerings. Nebuchadnezzar not only participated, but mastered the codes of symbolic power, understanding that to rule was also to embody a divine narrative. This mystical awareness would follow him throughout life and would be essential to understanding the episodes of dreams, madness, and repentance that would later mark his path. As the young prince distinguished himself, his name began to resonate across the empire. Cuneiform records speak of his bravery and military success even before he became king. With Nabopolassar's death in 605 before Christ, Nebuchadnezzar had already defeated the Egyptians at the Battle of Carchemish and conquered territory as far as Syria and Palestine. Upon returning to Babylon, he was crowned without resistance, as he was already regarded as the true leader of the empire. His youth had been a proving ground, and he emerged from it a complete ruler, strategist, administrator, priest, and warrior. It was the beginning of a reign that would last more than 4 decades and transform the history of the Near East. The childhood and youth of Nebuchadnezzar reveal more than the story of a well-prepared prince. They reveal the birth of an imperial mindset. Raised between temples and battlefields, between clay tablets and bronze swords, he carried within him the unshakable conviction that his mission was divine, his authority sacred, and his Babylon eternal. That feeling would never leave him, not even in the darkest days of his life. The year was 605 before Christ. The walls of Babylon shimmered under the relentless heat of the Mesopotamian summer, and the empire recently established by Nabopolassar had just consolidated its victory over the Egyptians and the last remnants of Assyrian resistance. At that moment, the heir Nebuchadnezzar was far from home, leading his army on a campaign of expansion along the Levant. It was there, among the rivers of northern Syria, that he received the news of his father's death. Nabopolassar, the founder of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the man who restored the city's glory and defeated the greatest enemies of his generation, had passed away. The death of a king in any ancient civilization was always a delicate moment, not only because of mourning, but due to the potential disputes surrounding succession. Yet in Nebuchadnezzar's case, the transition was nearly immediate, a reflection of the authority he already exercised long before taking the throne. Nebuchadnezzar's coronation was not just a political act, but a deeply symbolic one. Upon learning of his father's death, he suspended military operations and rushed back to the capital. The journey may have taken weeks, crossing newly subjugated territories, deserts, and former battlefields. His arrival in Babylon was marked by religious ceremonies that signified both the earthly transition of power and the divine approval required to legitimize any new ruler. Nebuchadnezzar was anointed before the statue of Marduk in the main temple and proclaimed king of the Chaldeans, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Amorites, and of all the peoples now incorporated into the new empire. This was not merely the continuation of a reign, it was the beginning of an era. Unlike his father, who began his rule with rebellion, warfare, and reconstruction, Nebuchadnezzar inherited an empire that was already unified, structured, and internationally recognized. He inherited Nabopolassar's glories, but also the challenge of keeping them alive. That is why his first acts as king were marked by a proactive, even impatient, stance. Barely crowned, he resumed the Western military campaigns. The Battle of Carchemish, fought shortly before his father's death, still needed to be consolidated through permanent occupations, stabilized trade routes, and diplomatic agreements. With unquestionable authority and the support of seasoned generals trained under his father, Nebuchadnezzar set out to transform Babylon into not just a military power, but a civilizational one. Nebuchadnezzar's smooth succession was also due to another crucial factor: his military prestige. Even before Nabopolassar's death, the prince's name was feared by enemies and revered by allies. The victory over Egypt, one of the region's oldest and most respected civilizations, placed him on par with legendary figures like Sargon of Akkad and Ashurbanipal of Assyria. He had nothing left to prove. He was already a victorious warrior, and that erased any doubt about his legitimacy. Cuneiform records from the time describe a transition without ruptures, coups, or succession conflicts. In an era marked by betrayals and bloody disputes, this was a remarkable feat, and a testament to the level of preparation Nebuchadnezzar had received since youth. The enthronement of the new king was also a moment of spiritual reconnection with Babylonian identity. As was customary, he submitted to the annual ritual of humiliation during the Antiquity festival, in which the king had to be slapped by a priest and confess his insignificance before the gods. This symbolic act served not only to reinforce the spiritual role of the monarch, but also to remind the people that the king, no matter how powerful, remained under divine judgment. Nebuchadnezzar participated in the ritual with solemnity, strengthening his bond with the priesthood and securing the loyalty of the religious elite who controlled the temples, the calendars, the omens, and the interpretation of dreams, all central elements of Babylonian governance. With the succession secured, Nebuchadnezzar now faced a table full of responsibilities. Babylon was a nascent empire surrounded by wary powers, newly subjugated peoples, and unstable trade routes. His challenge was to turn military strength into political stability and cultural projection. He needed to build, negotiate, and govern, but never let his guard down, and he would do so with a unique combination of strategic brutality and architectural vision. The succession, far from being a mere transfer of power, represented the shift from an ideal of reconstruction to a project of lasting greatness. And Nebuchadnezzar, as we will see, had no intention of being just another king. He was ready to be remembered for centuries. The Battle of Carchemish, fought in 605 before Christ, was not merely a military confrontation, it was a historic turning point. In it, the fate of empires and the balance of power across the Fertile Crescent were decided. On one side stood Egypt, heir to one of the oldest and most revered civilizations of the ancient world, led by Pharaoh Necho II. On the other stood an emerging empire, Neo-Babylon, recently freed from Assyrian rule and commanded by a young general with relentless ambition, Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabopolassar. The battlefield was the strategic city of Carchemish, on the banks of the Euphrates River, near the border of what is now Syria. The city was a commercial and military jewel, a gateway between Mesopotamia and the Levant. Controlling Carchemish meant dominating the flow of wealth, armies, and cultures that connected the east and west of the known world. The context of the battle was dense and volatile. With the fall of the Assyrian Empire, the political map of the region had fragmented. Egypt, sensing the power vacuum left by the destruction of Nineveh and Assur, sought to expand its influence northward by attempting to control territories that once belonged to the Assyrians. Pharaoh Necho II mobilized his armies and marched north to stop Babylonian advances. Meanwhile, Nebuchadnezzar, already distinguishing himself as commander of his father's forces, saw Egypt's movement as a direct threat to the rebirth of their empire. The clash between these two powers became inevitable, and Carchemish, due to its geography and strategic importance, became the ground where fate would be sealed. Details of the battle were preserved in Babylonian inscriptions known as the Chronicles of Nebuchadnezzar, discovered on clay tablets. These records describe how the Babylonian army, directly led by Nebuchadnezzar, crossed the Euphrates and confronted the Egyptian forces with brutal efficiency. The battle was swift and decisive. Egyptian formations were destroyed, their troops either massacred or captured. Necho fled in a hasty retreat, abandoning his expansionist plans and marking the end of Egyptian influence over Syria and Palestine. This victory not only solidified Nebuchadnezzar as the supreme commander of the Babylonian forces, but also marked the beginning of a new regional hegemony, now centered in Babylon. The impact of the victory at Carchemish was immediate and profound. Politically, it eliminated Egypt as a direct military threat and allowed the Babylonians to occupy former Assyrian provinces without opposition. Cities like Damascus, Tyre, and Jerusalem came under pressure or were subdued, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire spread like a growing shadow across the Levant. Economically, it secured control over trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. Goods such as gold, incense, papyrus, olive oil, and textiles now flowed under Babylonian oversight. Culturally, it strengthened Nebuchadnezzar's position as a legitimate leader, one anointed not only by the gods of his people, but also confirmed by his victories on the battlefield. The glory of Babylon had returned, now carried by swords instead of scrolls. The victory at Carchemish also had spiritual and symbolic reverberations. In a world where wars were interpreted as battles between gods, Egypt's defeat was seen by the Babylonians as proof that Marduk, the supreme deity of Babylon, was mightier than the Egyptian gods. This theological interpretation was skillfully used by Nebuchadnezzar to justify his future campaigns and his authority over foreign peoples. He was not just a conqueror, he was the executor of a divine mandate. This religious narrative would be essential in the years to come, especially in dealings with peoples like the Hebrews, who fiercely resisted domination, but would eventually be conquered and exiled by a king who saw himself as an instrument of the heavens. Upon returning to Babylon after the victory, Nebuchadnezzar found the city in mourning over Nabopolassar's death. He was crowned king with solemn honors, but also as an invincible hero, the bearer of military glory and Babylon's destiny. Carchemish became a watershed moment in his life. Before it, he was a promising prince. After it, he was the undisputed sovereign of one of the most powerful empires in ancient history. This battle, so decisive yet often forgotten outside academic circles, is the moment when Babylon ceased to be a mere promise and became a dominant force in the ancient world, led by a king whose name would echo for centuries in chronicles, sacred scriptures, and the eternal ruins of the desert. With the victory at Carchemish secured and his official coronation as king of Babylon held amid popular euphoria and priestly support, Nebuchadnezzar launched one of the most ambitious phases of his reign, the territorial, administrative, and symbolic construction of a true empire. Babylon could no longer remain merely a sacred city or a relevant commercial hub. Under his leadership, it had to become the heart of a continental power, a capital worthy of shaping the destiny of entire peoples and, above all, rivaling the grandeur of any civilization known to that point, including Egypt and the now extinct Assyria. The first expansionist campaigns led by Nebuchadnezzar reveal more than military strategy. They unveil a mindset of lasting dominion, rooted in military force, economic control, and political propaganda. The initial thrust of his campaigns focused on consolidating the West. Regions of Syria, Phoenicia, and Palestine were in a state of instability, struggling to reorganize after the Assyrian collapse and Egypt's defeat. Nebuchadnezzar wasted no time. With his battle-hardened armies, he advanced into these territories, subjugating city-states such as Damascus, Tyre, and Sidon. These urban centers were important not only for their wealth, but for their capacity for resistance. Phoenicia, in particular, with its coastal cities, represented a strategic key to accessing the Mediterranean's maritime trade. By seizing these routes and coastal outposts, Nebuchadnezzar extended Babylon's influence beyond anything his predecessors had dreamed of, while simultaneously cutting off the potential for coordinated resistance among smaller kingdoms. Simultaneously, Palestine became the next major focus. The Hebrew cities, especially Jerusalem, remained in constant tension, at times aligning with Egypt to resist Babylonian rule, at other times trying to maintain independence through fragile agreements. Nebuchadnezzar dealt with this wavering with an iron hand. Through successive campaigns, He imposed heavy tributes, deported local elites, and responded to even minor rebellions with siege and destruction. The first deportation of the Hebrews, which exiled thousands, especially the educated, was a calculated strategy, not only to weaken local resistance, but to enrich the Babylonian court with scholars, scribes, artisans, and priests. This type of population engineering, typical of empires at the time, transformed diversity into a tool for centralization. On the internal front, Nebuchadnezzar understood that territorial expansion required organization. An empire cannot be maintained by swords alone. For this reason, he developed communication routes between the provinces, reinforced military garrisons, established tax collection systems, and appointed local governors, usually trusted Chaldeans, to oversee the conquered lands. This web of control allowed information, resources, and troops to flow quickly between the outskirts and the capital, ensuring swift responses to any threat. In addition, Babylon became a showcase of power. By bringing tributes, statues of conquered gods, war chariots, and prisoners from various peoples to parade through the city streets, Nebuchadnezzar created a daily visual spectacle that reinforced his image of invincibility. Another notable aspect of these campaigns was how Nebuchadnezzar blended diplomacy with domination. In some regions, he preferred to maintain submissive local kings, the so-called vassals, instead of installing Babylonian governors. This strategy created a network of dependence that allowed the empire to expand without completely exhausting its resources. However, this tolerance always hinged on total obedience. One rebellion or delayed tribute was enough for the king to act with extreme severity. This dual posture, as negotiator and destroyer, made him a figure both feared and revered. Within a few years, his name became synonymous with domination, and the inscriptions he had carved into temples and palaces proclaimed his authority as both a divine gift and an inescapable reality. Nebuchadnezzar's early expansionist campaigns did more than enlarge the empire. They redefined its very nature. By uniting diverse peoples under a single scepter, organizing long-range administrative foundations, and imposing Babylon's name as the center of power, he transformed military victory into an imperial system. What Nabopolassar had initiated, Nebuchadnezzar was elevating to a new level. Babylon was no longer merely a sacred city of the Chaldeans. It had become the radiating center of culture, religion, warfare, and economy, and the surrounding world had begun to revolve under its gravity. After consolidating his military conquests and stabilizing the empire's borders, Nebuchadnezzar turned his attention to what would ultimately define his reign, transforming the city of Babylon into a visible symbol of power, splendor, and eternity. More than just an administrative or military center, Babylon would become a monument to the glory of the gods, to human engineering, and to the absolute rule of a king who saw himself as the restorer of an ordered world. The grandeur of its constructions, the meticulous urban planning, and the architectural aesthetic that blended tradition and innovation made the city not merely the capital of an empire, but a living showcase of what it meant to rule with divine purpose. The monumentalization of Babylon began with its most fundamental elements, the walls. Nebuchadnezzar ordered the construction of double fortifications that surrounded the city, towering dozens of meters high and wide enough to allow war chariots to pass along their tops. These walls not only protected the capital from invasions, but also gave any approaching traveler the overwhelming impression of an unreachable, invincible city, one separated from the chaos beyond. Each brick of these colossal walls was inscribed with the king's name, a perpetual reminder of who had raised such a titanic structure. The monumental gates, most notably the famed Ishtar Gate, were not mere entrances, but ceremonial arches adorned with glazed bricks depicting lions, bulls, and dragons, representing protective deities and the authority of the crown. The urban heart of Babylon was crossed by the processional way, a wide paved avenue that stretched from the city limits to the great temple of Marduk, the Asagila. Along this path, annual religious processions passed during the Akitu festival, when the statue of the god was carried in ceremony to the sanctuary to symbolically renew the order of the world. This avenue was more than a route. It was a cosmic axis. Along its length, royal palaces, ziggurats, and smaller temples were aligned in an urban choreography that united political power with religious worldview. Nebuchadnezzar's own palace, situated near the wall, was a colossal construction, containing hundreds of rooms, inner courtyards, and halls adorned with reliefs, precious metals, and cuneiform inscriptions. One of the most fascinating elements of Babylon's architecture under Nebuchadnezzar was its use of color and brightness. Unlike the stone constructions of the Egyptians or Greeks, the Babylonians built with clay bricks, but developed glazing and painting techniques that brought the buildings to life. The facades of temples and palaces were covered in vitreous tiles in cobalt blue, gold, white, and green, forming symbolic images, geometric patterns, and mythological scenes. Under the scorching Mesopotamian sun, the contrast of these colors created a surreal vision. Foreign visitors, including emissaries from distant kings, were astonished by the harmony between the robustness of the structures and the delicacy of their ornamentation. Another monumental feature of the city was its religious complex. The main temple of Marduk, the Asagila, was the spiritual center of Babylon and the ultimate symbol of the alliance between the king and the divine pantheon. Beside it rose the Etemenanki, the colossal ziggurat that many scholars believe inspired the biblical myth of the Tower of Babel. With 7 ascending levels and more than 90 meters in height, this pyramid-like structure symbolized a staircase between heaven and earth. The climb to the top was reserved for priests and the most sacred rituals. Nebuchadnezzar restored and expanded these constructions with near-religious zeal, making them not only places of worship, but also architectural declarations of Babylon's centrality in the cosmos ordained by the gods. The impact of this monumentalism was not merely symbolic, it was also psychological and political. Upon entering the city, every visitor, whether a subject, merchant, or defeated enemy, was immediately confronted with the superhuman scale of imperial power. Everything in Babylon conveyed control, order, and permanence, and this impression was not limited to the present. Nebuchadnezzar sought eternity. His buildings, inscriptions, walls, and avenues were designed to withstand time, not only physical decay, but historical oblivion. His name would be etched into every wall, gate, and foundation. The city became a mirror of his reign, and the reign a visible extension of the god's will. The monumental Babylon that emerged under Nebuchadnezzar was therefore more than a city. It was an urban-scale message, a concrete manifestation that order, justice, and power flowed from a single center, directed by a single sovereign. And just as the stones of its walls protected the people, they also safeguarded the memory of a king who wished to be remembered not only for his conquests, but for the splendor he made bloom in the heart of the desert. Among all the wonders attributed to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, none exerts as much fascination as the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Regarded as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, these gardens are described as an unprecedented architectural and botanical feat, an artificial paradise built in the heart of the desert, where fruit trees, palm groves, exotic flowers, and vineyards grew on elevated terraces, irrigated by a complex system that defied gravity. The most enduring image is that of a terraced green mountain built from stone, its steps rising toward the heavens like a verdant temple, offering shade, fragrance, and cool air beneath the scorching Mesopotamian sun. Yet amid the enchantment of this vision, one question remains. Did these gardens truly exist? Or are they the product of persistent myth, distant reports, or royal propaganda deeply rooted in civilization's collective memory? The most popular tradition holds that the Hanging Gardens were built by Nebuchadnezzar to please his wife, Amytis of Media, who missed the green mountains of her homeland. The story, handed down through Greek historians such as Berossus, Strabo, and Diodorus Siculus, claims the king, in an act of love and power, commissioned an artificial structure that mimicked terraced hills covered with lush vegetation, towering trees, and artificial waterfalls. Achieving this would have required not only exceptional engineering skill, but also cutting-edge hydraulic systems capable of raising water from the Euphrates River to the upper levels of the gardens, possibly using water wheels, bucket chains, and aqueducts. However, the greatest mystery surrounding the Hanging Gardens is the complete absence of direct Babylonian records about their construction. Despite Nebuchadnezzar leaving behind extensive inscriptions celebrating his achievements, from battles to the building of temples and walls, none of his texts mention the gardens. This is, at the very least, curious, given that Babylonian kings routinely documented every significant work in detail, especially those tied to their glory and divine favor. This documentary silence has led modern scholars to speculate that the gardens may have been a foreign idealization or even a case of mistaken identity, possibly confused with similar structures in other Mesopotamian cities, such as Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, where King Sennacherib reportedly built comparable terraced gardens. Despite the lack of local sources, the persistence of foreign accounts keeps the hypothesis of the garden's existence alive. Diodorus describes tiered terraces supported by stone columns, with large trees planted on masonry platforms and irrigated through hidden mechanisms. Strabo details the use of screws and shafts to move water upward. These descriptions suggest an advanced architectural concept, even more remarkable given the region's scarcity of natural stone, requiring either imported materials or ingenious adaptations with brick and bitumen. The Babylonians' hydraulic ingenuity is well documented in other contexts, which lends plausibility to the idea of vertical irrigation systems. Another argument supporting the garden's existence, even if symbolic, is the very nature of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. We know he transformed Babylon into an imperial showcase, filled with colorful temples, ceremonial avenues, monumental gates, and ziggurats of epic scale. In this context of political and aesthetic self-affirmation, the creation of an elevated paradise within the city walls would be a natural extension of his vision of grandeur. The gardens, whether real or not, function as a metaphor for dominion. The king not only subdued peoples but also tamed nature. He made the impossible bloom, showing that where there was once desert, now there was abundance. An alternative theory, proposed by some modern archaeologists, is that the Hanging Gardens may have existed in Nineveh, not Babylon. Inscriptions from the Assyrian king Sennacherib mention a palace without rival, featuring advanced irrigation systems, descriptions that partially align with Greek accounts. This raises the possibility that classical authors confused the cities, relocating the gardens to Babylon due to Nebuchadnezzar's later fame. If so, the Hanging Gardens would be a transplanted myth, a glorious echo of another city, appropriated and reimagined by collective memory, yet inseparably linked to the figure of Nebuchadnezzar. Whether as a real structure or enduring symbol, the Hanging Gardens continue to represent the pinnacle of ancient imagination. They embody the idea that true power lies not only in conquering lands or raising walls, but in shaping landscapes, redirecting rivers, and turning a city into a mirror of paradise. Nebuchadnezzar, the king who conquered peoples and built colossal palaces, may have left his deepest mark on something that, paradoxically, may never have existed. And yet the gardens remain alive, not in clay, but in the imagination of the world. In the sacred heart of Babylon, amid cyclopean walls and ceremonial avenues, there rose a structure that challenged the sky and symbolized the direct link between the world of men and the realm of the gods, the ziggurat of Etemenanki. More than a religious edifice, this stepped colossus was the point of convergence between faith, power, and architecture. The pinnacle of Mesopotamian spirituality materialized in baked clay and precious stones. To the Babylonians, Etemenanki literally meant the foundation of heaven and earth, a name that encapsulated the cosmic essence of the tower. According to archaeological records and ancient descriptions, this ziggurat may have been the true inspiration behind what biblical tradition later immortalized as the Tower of Babel, a symbol of human ambition and the division of languages that marked the beginning of humanity's dispersion. Originally built around the 2nd millennium before Christ, the ziggurat underwent multiple phases of destruction and reconstruction, reaching its most majestic form during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. The king invested colossal resources into its restoration and expansion, transforming it into a 7-tiered structure, estimated to stand between 80 and 90 meters tall, surpassing any other building in ancient Mesopotamia. Each level symbolized a celestial sphere, a stage of spiritual ascent, and the top housed a sanctuary dedicated to Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon. Access to the summit was made by lateral ramps winding along the structure, a path that was not merely physical but symbolic. The ascent represented the soul's journey toward the divine. The visual impact of Etemenanki was overwhelming. Constructed with glazed clay bricks, its colors shifted between blue, gold, and white, reflecting the sky and sun in perfect harmony. Surrounding the ziggurat were smaller temples and sacred courtyards that made up the assagular complex, the spiritual and administrative center of the city. It was there that the most important rituals of the Babylonian calendar took place, especially the Akitu festival, during which the king ritually submitted to the gods and renewed the covenant, legitimizing his rule. Each year, the statue of Marduk was carried in a grand procession to the ziggurat, where it remained in symbolic fasting for several days before returning to the main temple. These rituals reinforced the idea that Babylon was not just a city, it was the axis of the universe ordered by the gods. The ziggurat also served as a marker of identity. Unlike subterranean or hidden temples found in other cultures, Etemenanke stood tall and open, visible from every part of the city and even from distant regions. It was an architectural declaration that Babylon was the center of the earth. Its monumentality served to intimidate foreigners and awe visitors, functioning as both diplomatic tool and psychological weapon. Rulers from other lands, upon entering the city and seeing the ziggurat, instinctively understood the scale of power concentrated there, not merely political or military, but cosmic. In a world where the visible and the sacred were intertwined, Etemenanke was proof that Nebuchadnezzar had conquered not only kingdoms, but celestial symmetry itself. The association between Etemenanke and the Tower of Babel solidified centuries later, especially through Jewish and Christian traditions. In the book of Genesis, humanity, speaking a single language, attempts to build a tower that reaches the heavens. In response, God confuses their language and disperses them. Although the biblical text does not name Nebuchadnezzar or Babylon directly, many scholars interpret the story as a symbolic reworking of what Etemenanke represented, a human attempt to ascend to the divine through their own means. The biblical tower thus becomes the inverted mirror of the real ziggurat. Where the Babylonians saw spiritual ascent and cosmic order, the Hebrews saw arrogance and disobedience. This contrast reveals not only religious divergences, but also deep cultural clashes between worldviews and models of civilization. The later history of the ziggurat reflects the fragility of human power before time. After the fall of the Babylonian Empire to Cyrus the Persian in 539 before Christ, Etemenanke was neglected, looted, and eventually destroyed. When Alexander the Great conquered the region 2 centuries later, he reportedly saw the ruins of the tower and ordered its reconstruction, a project that never materialized due to his sudden death. Centuries of abandonment, earthquakes, and material repurposing reduced the tower to rubble. Today, what remains of Etemenanke are archaeological traces near the modern city of Hilla in Iraq, covered by the dust of time, yet still pulsing with the magnetism of their past. Thus, the ziggurat of Etemenanke, even in ruins, remains one of the highest expressions of sacred architecture in the ancient world. It represented not only the link between heaven and earth, but also a king's attempt to translate eternity into clay. Nebuchadnezzar, in restoring it with ambition and reverence, sealed his name not just into the walls of Babylon, but into the imagination of the world. And even though the stones have fallen and the levels have vanished, the tower still stands, not in the desert, but in the collective memory of human civilization. To truly understand the figure of Nebuchadnezzar, one must go beyond viewing him as a strategist, builder, or ruler. It is essential to dive into his most profound and foundational dimension, his relationship with the sacred. In the symbolic universe of Babylon, the king was not merely a manager of land or a commander of armies. He was the direct representative of the gods, the mediator between the world of men and the divine realm, and his earthly authority was only legitimate if it reflected the celestial order. Among all the gods in the vast Mesopotamian pantheon, one occupied the center of the cosmos and royal power, Marduk. And it was in the worship of this supreme god that Nebuchadnezzar built the spiritual foundation of his empire, transforming religion into the cornerstone, language, and invisible force that sustained all his decisions. Marduk was not just the god of Babylon. He was, according to myth, the creator of the world, the one who had vanquished the forces of primordial chaos and organized the heavens, the earth, and time. His temple, the Esagila, stood beside the colossal ziggurat Etemenanke, forming with it the spiritual center of the city. It was within this complex that the most sacred rituals were held, and where Nebuchadnezzar regularly appeared to reinforce the alliance between throne and altar. In his numerous inscriptions left on walls, tablets, and building foundations, the king always presented himself as servant of Marduk, restorer of his temples, executor of his justice, not as an autonomous sovereign, but as the living instrument of divine will. This devotion, far from being rhetorical, guided his internal policies, diplomacy, and military campaigns. The Babylonian religious calendar was meticulously organized around lunar phases and agricultural cycles, and the king personally participated in the most important ceremonies. Chief among them was the Antiquity festival, celebrated at the start of each year. During this festival, Nebuchadnezzar underwent a ritual of symbolic humiliation. He was stripped of his royal garments, led into the temple by priests, and there he was slapped in front of Marduk's statue, swearing submission to the god. This act, far from weakening the king, renewed his authority in the eyes of the people. It was a powerful dramatization of the idea that all human power depends on divine grace. At the end of the ritual, the king recovered his regalia and led a triumphant procession through the city, now reconsecrated as the legitimate representative of cosmic order. The Temple of Marduk was not only a center of worship, but also a hub of administration, economy, and intellect. It housed archives with thousands of cuneiform tablets, schools for scribes, astronomical observatories, and religious courts. Priests influenced state decisions, interpreted omens, supervised rituals, and advised the king in times of crisis. Nebuchadnezzar understood the strategic value of this alliance with the clergy and continuously invested in the restoration of temples, expansion of rituals, and production of inscriptions that exalted Marduk. This religious investment was also political. By presenting his reign as an expression of divine will, the king silenced criticism, justified wars, and maintained cohesion among the diverse peoples that formed his empire. Another essential aspect of Nebuchadnezzar's faith was his theological view of war. Every conquest, every subdued city, every deported population was interpreted as part of the divine plan laid out by Marduk. The gods of conquered peoples were often brought to Babylon, not simply as trophies, but as evidence of the spiritual supremacy of the Chaldean pantheon. The temples of defeated cities were often destroyed or rebuilt according to Babylonian standards, and their priests incorporated into the capital's liturgical system. This created a symbolic unification of the empire. Regardless of language or origin, all were under the dominion of Marduk, and therefore under the protection and rule of the king. Nebuchadnezzar's spirituality also manifested in moments of introspection. Cuneiform texts and later traditions, especially biblical accounts, indicate that the king, despite his power, acknowledged the limits imposed by the gods. Troubling dreams, existential crises, periods of silence and solitude appear associated with the monarch, as if he himself understood the burden of carrying the fate of an entire world on his shoulders. His faith, therefore, was not only public or ceremonial, it was also personal, profound, and often ambiguous. A man who spoke with the gods, who feared and revered them, even when tempted by the vanity of absolute power. Nebuchadnezzar and religion are not separate elements. They are dimensions of the same phenomenon. His reign cannot be understood without Marduk's temple, without the rituals, the symbols, the processions, the oracles, the dreams, and the sacrifices. He ruled not only with armies and laws, but with myths, visions, and the conviction that his authority emanated from a heavenly throne. And perhaps this is why his image, even after millennia, continues to fascinate and unsettle, because he was not just a king among many, but one who dared to reign as a messenger of the gods, building an empire where faith and power were interwoven like the stones of his eternal temples. As Nebuchadnezzar expanded the borders of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, subjugating kingdoms, city-states, and diverse peoples, a crucial question arose for the success of his imperial project: how to manage the cultural, political, and religious diversity of such a vast territory. Governing did not simply mean winning battles, but maintaining obedience after victory, ensuring the steady flow of tribute, suppressing rebellions, and above all, making the presence of Babylon felt even from afar. To achieve this, Nebuchadnezzar built a sophisticated system of imperial control based on three pillars: permanent military domination, enforced diplomacy, and a tributary network that channeled wealth from the peripheries to the center. Conquered peoples quickly learned that under Babylonian rule, Obedience was rewarded with relative autonomy, and disobedience with complete destruction. The first layer of this control was permanent military presence. Conquered cities were required to host Babylonian garrisons, often composed of Chaldean soldiers, trusted mercenaries, and loyal royal officers. Fortifications were built or restored to protect trade routes, military corridors, and administrative posts. The constant presence of armed forces served as a visible and immediate reminder that the empire was always watchful. For local populations, this meant a significant loss of sovereignty. Their decisions became monitored, and any sign of insubordination was swiftly punished. Nebuchadnezzar's policy of reprisals was known for its efficiency and brutality. Cities that resisted or rebelled were besieged, looted, destroyed, and their elites deported to Babylon. This system of selective deportation was one of the most effective strategies for containing rebellion. Instead of exterminating entire populations, the king removed the most influential segments, nobles, priests, scribes, and skilled artisans, and relocated them to other regions of the empire. The most emblematic case is that of the Hebrews taken into captivity after the destruction of Jerusalem. This forced relocation served multiple purposes. It weakened rebellious centers, fed the Babylonian economic and intellectual engine with qualified labor, and blended ethnicities and cultures to dilute local identities. Over time, deported peoples lost part of their cohesion and integrated into the rhythms of the empire. For Nebuchadnezzar, captivity was not merely punishment. It was a tool of imperial engineering. Beyond force, the empire also operated through compulsory diplomacy. Local rulers could keep their thrones as vassals, provided they swore loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar, sent regular tributes, and recognized Marduk's supremacy. These relationships were formalized through treaties, marriage alliances, the presence of ambassadors, and ceremonial visits to Babylon. Yet the alliance was always unequal. The Babylonian king reserved the right to intervene militarily, depose vassal kings, and impose extraordinary tributes at will. Diplomacy served to create an illusion of negotiated order, but at its core, it was merely a disguise for the unilateral imposition of central power. Even cooperating kings lived under constant threat. Any suspicion of betrayal could unleash devastating reprisals. The tributary system was the financial backbone of the entire mechanism. Conquered regions were required to supply a combination of natural goods, such as gold, silver, copper, cedarwood, grains, and fine textiles, along with forced labor and strategic resources like horses and weapons. These tributes were stored in Babylon's granaries and treasuries and redistributed according to the state's needs. Massive caravans crossed the empire, connecting the subjugated territories with the center of power. The continuous flow of wealth reinforced the image of the capital as the navel of the world, feeding its temples, palaces, and armies. For the conquered peoples, tribute was both a burden and a symbolic barrier. To pay was to acknowledge their inferiority, their subordinate status, their ongoing defeat. Despite the oppression, there were also mechanisms of incorporation. Peoples who cooperated with the empire could receive favors, debt forgiveness, partial freedom, permission to rebuild local temples, or official recognition of their deities. In many cases, conquered gods were brought to Babylon not as war trophies, but as guests in the imperial pantheon. This symbolic absorption created an illusion of respect and religious unity. The empire functioned as a devouring machine of cultures. It did not destroy them completely, but assimilated, reshaped, and turned them into pieces of a mosaic whose absolute center was Babylon and its king. Nebuchadnezzar's relationship with the conquered peoples cannot be described as purely violent or authoritarian. It was also complex, structured, and adaptive. The king understood that lasting dominance is not built with swords alone, but with systems. By combining fear and integration, destruction and diplomacy, punishment and prestige, he established an empire that, for a few decades, functioned with impressive cohesion. Subjugated peoples may have hated him, but they knew that to defy him meant annihilation. This reputation sustained peace, a heavy, controlled, imposed peace, and that was exactly what Nebuchadnezzar wanted, an empire where everyone knew their place. Among all of Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns, one stood out not only for the brutality of the event itself, but for the spiritual and historical resonance that would echo for millennia: the destruction of Jerusalem. The sacred city of the Hebrews, perched in the hills of Judea, was far more than a fortress or the capital of a small kingdom. For its people, it was the center of a covenant with the one God, the place where Solomon's temple housed the Ark of the Covenant and the rituals that ensured divine order. To Nebuchadnezzar, however, Jerusalem was a point of instability on the western flank of his empire, a city that, though vassal, kept conspiring with Egypt and resisting Babylonian dominance. It was a threat that could no longer be tolerated. Tension between Jerusalem and Babylon began with the siege of 597 before Christ. On that occasion, Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city and forced King Jehoiakim to surrender. Rather than destroy it completely, the Chaldean king applied his usual policy. He deposed the monarch, took him captive to Babylon along with part of the Jewish elite, and installed a vassal king, Zedekiah, who was expected to maintain order and loyalty to the imperial crown. But peace was short-lived. Zedekiah, pressured by local leaders and seduced by the promise of Egyptian support, broke the agreement with Babylon. This rebellion, in Nebuchadnezzar's eyes, was not just a political insult, but a spiritual affront to the cosmic order his empire embodied. The response would be total. In 586 before Christ, Nebuchadnezzar returned with his armies and began a second siege of Jerusalem. This time, there would be no tolerance, no diplomacy, and no partial exile. For months, the Babylonians surrounded the city, blocked its gates, cut off supplies, and left the population weakened by hunger and fear. The siege was methodical, cruel, and relentless. When the walls finally gave way, the city was invaded, looted, and razed. Solomon's temple, the spiritual heart of Judaism, was set ablaze, its relics taken to Babylon, and much of the population deported. Biblical records describe the event with anguish and reverence, acknowledging it as a dramatic turning point in Jewish history. It marked the beginning of the Babylonian exile, one of the most traumatic and identity-defining experiences of the Jewish people. The destruction of Jerusalem was not merely a military act, it was a spiritual devastation. The temple was believed to be the visible dwelling place of God on earth. Its fall was interpreted by many Jews of the time as divine judgment on the corruption of the people and their leaders. Prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel reflected on the calamity not only as a political consequence, but as part of a larger plan for purification and renewal. For Nebuchadnezzar, however, it was all imperial strategy, the ultimate lesson for any city that dared challenge Babylon's authority. It was a declaration that no local god, no matter how sacred to its people, could resist the will of Marduk and the might of his empire. From an administrative perspective, the Jewish exile was handled with the same pragmatism as other deportations. Prisoners, especially scribes, priests, artisans, and nobles, were resettled in Babylonian-controlled regions, with some freedom to maintain their language, religion, and customs. There was no explicit attempt to force total assimilation. On the contrary, Babylon seemed interested in maintaining the cohesion of these communities, as long as they remained submissive and productive. During this period, significant transformations occurred within Judaism itself, such as the elevation of the Torah, the strengthening of oral tradition, and the rise of a form of worship centered on prayer and study, replacing the sacrificial rituals of the temple. Curiously, even with all the destruction, Nebuchadnezzar's name is cited with ambivalence in Hebrew tradition. He is at once the instrument of divine wrath and the agent of a new historical phase, a devastating enemy, yet also a figure who, according to some sources, would later acknowledge the sovereignty of the God of Israel. This complexity reveals the profound impact the episode of Jerusalem had, not only on the geopolitics of the ancient Near East, but also on the theology and collective memory of a people who, far from vanishing, transformed their suffering into cultural resilience. The siege of Jerusalem is one of the darkest moments in ancient history, but also one of the most revealing. It shows the reach of Nebuchadnezzar's imperial policy, his intolerance for betrayal, and his ability to act with both brute force and social reorganization. It also shows how a city can be reduced to ashes and still plant the seed of a faith that will endure centuries of oppression. The temple fell, the people were taken, the walls collapsed. But from Babylon, under the watchful eye of the very king who conquered them, the exiles began to rebuild their identity. And over time, even the rivers of captivity would witness the birth of a hope that not even Nebuchadnezzar could extinguish. When the walls of Jerusalem were torn down and the temple set ablaze under the disciplined fury of Nebuchadnezzar's troops, a new chapter began in the history of the Hebrew people, not marked by kings or battles, but by silence, displacement, and spiritual reconstruction. The so-called Babylonian captivity was not merely a geographic exile. It was a profound transformation of Jewish identity, taken by force from their homeland and brought to the heart of the Babylonian Empire. The Hebrews did not experience extinction, as the conqueror might have hoped, but reinvention. Amid the canals of the Euphrates and the shadows of ziggurats, far from Zion and the temple rituals, they learned to keep faith, memory, and hope alive, even when everything around them seemed lost. The first wave of deportations occurred in 597 before Christ, shortly after Jerusalem's initial surrender. A second, far more drastic wave followed in 586, with the total destruction of the city. In all, thousands of Hebrews, especially members of the aristocracy, priests, scribes, artisans, and merchants, were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers eastward, crossing deserts and rivers until they reached Babylon. There they were not placed in prison camps, but settled in specific communities, such as the banks of the Chebar River, mentioned in the book of the prophet Ezekiel. They could move freely, trade, work, build homes, and raise families, but always under surveillance without homeland or temple, two core elements of their former identity. Babylon was both oppressive and fascinating. The exiles encountered a massive, organized city full of markets, libraries, towers, temples, and gardens. It was a vibrant cosmopolitan metropolis where people from all corners of the empire crossed paths. Some Jews quickly adapted, taking up trades, learning Akkadian, and participating in local commerce. Others remained on the margins, resisting any form of assimilation. This internal tension between preservation and adaptation became one of the defining features of the exile. How could one maintain faith in a God who allowed the temple's destruction? How could one follow the laws of Moses, far from the promised land? How could one pray toward a place now in ruins? It was in this context that Judaism underwent a decisive mutation. Without the temple and its sacrifices, the religion focused on reading the Torah, prayer, and community teaching. Spiritual leadership expanded beyond the priestly class, tied to ritual worship, to include scribes and sages, figures who mastered the sacred texts and transmitted them orally. The first forms of what would later become synagogues emerged, spaces for gathering, study, and prayer. Spirituality became internalized, portable, resistant to space and time. The faith that once depended on a stone altar now lived in words, gestures, and memory. Many of the Bible's most poignant psalms were composed during this time. Psalm 137, for instance, is a moving elegy to the loss of Jerusalem. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept, remembering Zion. This lament was not mere nostalgia. It was an act of resistance. By singing their sorrow, the exiles reaffirmed their identity. Refusing to forget Jerusalem was a way of denying Nebuchadnezzar the conquest of their souls. Even in a foreign land without a temple, the Hebrews remained a people. More than that, a people who now understood that God did not dwell only in stones or sacred hills, but in the hearts of those who sought him. During the 70 years of captivity, Judaism strengthened its ethical and spiritual foundations. Prophets like Ezekiel and Daniel emerged during the exile, reinterpreting suffering as part of a greater plan, a pedagogical punishment, but also a promise of future restoration. Ezekiel had visions of a new temple and a purified people. Daniel, for his part, lived in the Babylonian court and showed that it was possible to serve a foreign king without renouncing faith. These figures revealed that exile was not the end of the story, but a path of learning. Suffering, far from destroying the people, refined them. Babylon, which sought to be the graveyard of Hebrew identity, became, ironically, its womb of rebirth. Meanwhile, Nebuchadnezzar, in his monumental court, saw the exile as just another instrument of power. In his eyes, the Hebrews had been defeated, subdued, assimilated. But what he failed to see was what grew in silence, a theology of resistance, a tradition that bloomed in the desert of longing, a faith that had learned to live without a place, and therefore one that could never be extinguished. The Babylonian Empire would fall, the temple would be rebuilt, but the impact of the captivity would be irreversible. It forged Judaism as a religion of the book, of memory, and of hope, and it left an eternal lesson that even when the land is lost, the soul can still stand tall. The figure of Nebuchadnezzar, portrayed in great detail in the Hebrew scriptures, goes far beyond that of a foreign king or distant conqueror. In the Bible, he is both an instrument of divine judgment and a deeply human character, subject to mysterious dreams, crises of pride, spiritual humblings, and ultimately the recognition of the sovereignty of a God he did not initially know. His role in the prophetic books, especially in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, reveals an unusual theological treatment, a pagan monarch turned protagonist of divine revelations. This narrative complexity reflects how the Babylonian exile deeply influenced Jewish theology, and how Nebuchadnezzar became a living symbol of the mysterious paths through which God acts in human history. In the books of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, Nebuchadnezzar is described as the servant of the Lord, a surprising expression for a foreign king. The reasoning behind this title lies in the prophet's understanding that the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of the Hebrew people were not random acts of brutality, but divine punishments. According to this interpretation, God used Nebuchadnezzar as an agent of correction, allowing him to conquer, besiege, and destroy the holy city. This vision caused anguish among the faithful, but also provided meaning to the catastrophe. The suffering was not gratuitous, but a response to idolatry, injustice, and the corruption of Judah's own kings. Thus Nebuchadnezzar, even without knowing the God of Israel, was fulfilling his will, and that placed him within the divine plan, albeit unknowingly. But it is in the book of Daniel that Nebuchadnezzar gains a deeper and more symbolic dimension. There, the king is not merely an instrument, he is a man undergoing transformation. Early in the book, he experiences cryptic dreams that none of his magicians can interpret. One of them is the famous dream of a statue made of various metals: gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay, representing the kingdoms of the earth. Only Daniel, a young deported Jew filled with the Spirit of God, is able to reveal and explain the dream's meaning. Upon hearing the interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar bows and acknowledges, "Truly your God is the God of gods." This marks a turning point. For the first time, the most powerful king on earth recognizes a deity beyond his own pantheon. Nebuchadnezzar's spiritual journey continues in later episodes, always marked by dreams and visions. In one of the most impactful, he dreams of a great tree that reaches the heavens, providing shelter and food for all, but which is cut down by divine order, symbolizing his downfall. Daniel warns him, the king must humble himself, abandon his pride, and acknowledge that all power comes from God. Nebuchadnezzar ignores the warning and is soon struck by a bout of madness, living like an animal for 7 years, eating grass, isolated from society, until he finally lifts his eyes to heaven, praises the Most High, and regains his sanity. This episode, deeply allegorical, is described as an intimate conversion. In the end, Nebuchadnezzar himself declares, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the King of heaven." The Bible does not portray this king simplistically. He is neither merely a villain nor a full convert. He is a moral enigma, a mirror of the pride of the powerful, and a testament to the sovereignty of the God of Israel over all kingdoms. His journey shows that even the greatest empire can be shaken, and even the most prideful of kings can be brought low in order to learn reverence for what lies above every throne. In this context, Nebuchadnezzar becomes a symbol of a universal truth. Human glory is fleeting, and all dominion must bow before the eternal. Beyond the direct accounts, his presence lingers in many psalms, laments, and exile songs, where he is remembered as both the destroyer and, paradoxically, one touched by revelation. His image transcends the historical event to become a theological metaphor. Babylon, his city, comes to symbolize all that oppresses, but also that which can serve as a tool of divine pedagogy. And Nebuchadnezzar himself, who ordered the temple burned and the faithful exiled, ends his biblical appearances as someone who, in some way, was redeemed by the truth he discovered, not in the temples of Marduk, but in the awareness of the sovereignty of the God of heaven. In the end, the Bible does not present Nebuchadnezzar as a definitive enemy, but as a liminal figure, one who touched the sacred through twisted paths, who fell through pride and rose through recognition, a king who ruled over men but was taught by God, a foreigner who unknowingly inscribed through his actions one of the most profound chapters in the Hebrew faith, showing that even the mighty, if they listen, can learn to kneel. Few episodes in the scriptures possess the symbolic density and prophetic impact of the dream of the statue, as recounted in the second chapter of the book of Daniel. This passage is not merely a palace intrigue or an example of divine revelation. It represents one of the most significant moments of tension between human power and celestial authority. At the heart of this tension stands Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful king on earth, faced with something that neither his walls, nor his armies, nor his priests can control. A dream that deeply unsettles him and that no one can interpret, except for a young Hebrew captive filled with spiritual wisdom named Daniel. This encounter between an absolute monarch and an exiled prophet would become an eternal milestone in Scripture, symbolizing humility, mystery, and cosmic revelation. The account begins with the king deeply troubled. He has had a powerful dream that leaves him restless and without peace. But instead of sharing the dream's content with his advisors, he makes a drastic demand. He wants them to both describe the dream and interpret it. It is a deadly test. None of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, or astrologers of the court can meet the challenge. In anger, Nebuchadnezzar orders all the wise men of Babylon to be executed. It is in this atmosphere of urgency and fear that Daniel steps forward, asking for time to seek the revelation from the God of heaven. He prays, and during the night, the mystery is revealed to him in a vision. Daniel then approaches the king, not only to save the lives of the wise men, but to deliver a message that would reshape theology and ancient geopolitics. According to Daniel, the dream was of a colossal statue, made of different materials. The head was pure gold, the chest and arms, silver, the belly and thighs, bronze, the legs, iron, and the feet, partly iron and partly clay. As the king watched, a stone, not cut by human hands, struck the statue's feet, shattering the entire structure. The stone then became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Daniel interprets the vision. The statue represents a succession of empires that will dominate the world. The head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar himself, the first and most glorious of kingdoms. But others will follow, each less splendid than the last, until a final eternal kingdom, symbolized by the stone, will destroy all the others and never pass away. This interpretation holds many layers. On the immediate level, Daniel acknowledges Nebuchadnezzar's greatness, calling him the King of Kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, power, strength, and glory. But he also reminds him that this power is temporary. His position, though majestic, is merely the first step in a sequence that will end with the rise of a higher, eternal kingdom, one not built by human hands, in other words, divine. The message is clear. Nebuchadnezzar is great, but not absolute. He reigns by permission, and his empire, like all that follow, will eventually fall. Only the kingdom of God will endure. The impact of this revelation on Nebuchadnezzar is profound. He bows before Daniel, acknowledges the superiority of the God of the Hebrews, and promotes Daniel to governor of the province of Babylon, chief of the wise men, and royal advisor. It is a moment of admiration and respect, where the Babylonian king bows not just to an interpretation, but to the idea that there is a God who reveals mysteries, something neither his priests nor his Babylonian gods could do. Daniel, in turn, becomes a living bridge between two worlds, spiritual and political, exile and throne, prophecy and empire. But the dream of the statue is more than a message for a king. Over the centuries, it has become one of the most debated visions in prophetic tradition. Many scholars identify the sequence of metals with the major empires of antiquity: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Others see a more symbolic structure, representing the progressive fragility of human civilizations. The stone that shatters the statue symbolizes divine judgment, interrupting the cycle of earthly empires and ushering in a new era. For biblical readers and Jewish exiles alike, the vision carried a concrete hope. No empire is eternal, not even Babylon. The dream of the statue is, therefore, a grand parable about power and its limits. Nebuchadnezzar, conqueror of nations and destroyer of Jerusalem's temple, is confronted with a truth no general can ignore. Every kingdom built by men is destined to fall. The great lesson, delivered by a young, seemingly insignificant captive, is that true dominion does not come from swords, gold, or stone columns, but from a living rock, hurled by unseen hands, shaping history according to eternal purposes. Nebuchadnezzar heard this lesson, and for a time at least he seemed to understand it. Amid the imperial splendor of Babylon, surrounded by golden columns, mighty armies, and ceremonial rituals that reinforced his authority daily, Nebuchadnezzar decided to erect a colossal image, a statue of pure gold, over 30 meters tall, placed on the plain of Dura, designed not merely as a symbol of his kingdom's glory, but as a living testament to his supremacy over all peoples under his rule. It was a monument that left no room for doubt. All were to bow, both literally and spiritually, before the figure that represented the king's absolute power. This act marked the beginning of one of the most emblematic episodes in biblical literature, the fiery furnace. In it, 3 young Hebrews deported from Judea refused to kneel before the statue. What followed was a confrontation between imperial pride and the quiet faith of those who would not bend the knee. The 3 young men were named Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Hebrew names that were changed in Babylon to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They belonged to the exiled elite and had been educated at court, like Daniel. They held administrative positions and were respected, but when the royal decree commanded all to bow before the image at the sound of trumpets and ceremonial instruments, they remained standing, not out of political rebellion, but spiritual conviction. To them, bowing before an idol meant betraying the covenant with the God of Israel. When Nebuchadnezzar learned of their disobedience, he was enraged. He could not understand how 3 foreigners, beneficiaries of his favor and well placed within the state apparatus, would dare defy his order. The challenge was intolerable. The punishment would be exemplary. The furnace was heated 7 times hotter than usual, an exaggeration that reveals the king's desire not merely to execute the young men, but to annihilate them, to obliterate their defiance with undeniable fire. The 3 were bound in their garments and thrown into the flames by the king's own soldiers, who died from the extreme heat upon approach. But the miracle began inside the fire. Witnesses, including Nebuchadnezzar himself, saw with astonishment that the youths were walking freely within the furnace, untouched, and that a 4th figure, luminous and supernatural, was with them. The biblical description speaks of one like a son of the gods, a mysterious presence protecting them and rendering the fire powerless. Upon seeing this, Nebuchadnezzar was stunned. He called the 3 men out of the furnace, and they emerged without a single burn, without the smell of smoke, their hair untouched. It was a moment of spiritual rupture. Before his entire court, the Babylonian king declared, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants. No other God can save like this," and more. He issued a new decree forbidding any people, language, or nation from speaking against their God under penalty of death. What began as a display of imperial power ended in the public acknowledgement of a God the empire could not command. The miracle of the fiery furnace symbolically represents the tension between 2 models of power, the vertical, coercive one imposed by human systems, and the invisible, internal one sustained by faith. Babylon had armies, gold, walls, and decrees, but those 3 young men had conviction, memory, and the courage not to yield. By choosing to die rather than betray their faith, they offered the world a timeless example of peaceful resistance, and by emerging unscathed from the flames, they proved that faithfulness, even when quiet, can stir the supernatural. Once again, Nebuchadnezzar was faced with something his hands could not seize, nor his decrees control. This episode also reminds us of the spiritual ambiguity of Nebuchadnezzar himself. At times he demands worship for himself. At others he acknowledges the God of the Hebrews. He is a man in conflict, driven by vanity, yet touched by revelations beyond him. The fiery furnace did not merely spare lives, it exposed the fragility of human pride before what is eternal, and it showed that even in the heart of empire, amid absolute power, humble faith could still burn brighter than any fire in Babylon. The story of Nebuchadnezzar up to this point is marked by overwhelming conquests, colossal constructions, supernatural revelations, and encounters with prophets who, from time to time, restrained his pride. Yet, despite having witnessed signs, dreams interpreted by Daniel, Miracles like the fiery furnace, public declarations of praise to the God of the Hebrews, the king's heart remained divided. Beneath his occasional proclamations of humility lay a latent, growing pride, sustained by all he had built: his palace, his walls, his temples, his armies, his decrees. Every stone in Babylon seemed to whisper that he was invincible, that false security would become the trigger for his fall. Nebuchadnezzar's pride would not be undone by foreign armies or political betrayal, but by something far more silent, devastating, and irreversible: a spiritual humiliation sent from above. The episode unfolds once more through a dream, recorded in the 4th chapter of the book of Daniel. This time Nebuchadnezzar dreams of an immense tree that reached the heavens, with a lush canopy, welcoming shade, and abundant fruit. All creatures on earth found shelter beneath it. But then a celestial watcher descends and commands that the tree be cut down, its branches stripped, its fruit scattered, and a band of iron placed around its stump. Moreover, the tree's heart would be transformed from human to animal, and for 7 periods it would live among the beasts of the field, eating grass and sleeping in the open. The king, disturbed, summons Daniel. The interpretation is direct, striking, and dark. The tree is Nebuchadnezzar himself. His greatness would be stripped away, his sanity lost, and he would live like an animal until he acknowledged that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men. Daniel, though fearful, advises the king to repent, to practice justice, and to help the poor, hoping the judgment might be averted. But Nebuchadnezzar's pride had already hardened. 12 months later, he walks upon the terraces of his palace, gazes at the monumental city before him, Babylon with its towers, temples, and gardens, and says, "Is this not the great Babylon I have built by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" At that very moment, the sentence is fulfilled. The king goes mad. He loses his reason, his throne, his privileges. He begins living among the animals, his body soaked by dew, his hair growing like eagle's feathers, his nails like claws. It is the most symbolic and extreme image of the fall of a man who thought himself a god. This period of madness is not described in detail, but its symbolic weight is immense. The king who once dwelled in marble halls and ordered statues of himself is now crawling through the grass, speechless, crownless, nameless. The man who had everything experiences absolute nothingness. The humiliation is total, and yet in that abyss something begins to grow. After 7 periods, which may signify 7 years or a complete spiritual cycle, Nebuchadnezzar lifts his eyes to heaven and finally acknowledges his dominion is eternal and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. At that moment, his reason is restored, and with it the glory of his kingdom. But now his speech is different. He no longer exalts himself. Instead, he declares that all the inhabitants of the earth are as nothing before the Most High, and that no one can resist his hand. Nebuchadnezzar's pride is one of the central themes of biblical theology. He is the archetypal image of a man who elevates himself to believe he is above all, and who for that very reason must be broken. His fall is both a punishment and an opportunity for redemption. He was not destroyed, but brought low so he might see. His madness was pedagogical. The field, the grass, the loss of all things human, all of it served as a mirror, and when he finally recognized the true source of his power, he was restored, not as the same man, but as one transformed. This episode reveals the classic cycle of human pride in the face of the sacred: ascent, vanity, fall, and revelation. Nebuchadnezzar was not defeated by external enemies. He was undone by his own arrogance, and paradoxically, by losing everything, he discovered what truly mattered. The glory of Babylon, as magnificent as it was fleeting, but the fear of God, the recognition of eternity, the humility before the infinite, these were unshakable foundations. And by learning this, Nebuchadnezzar, the King of Kings, became at last only a servant. Among the most striking accounts in biblical literature and ancient spiritual history, few are as symbolic, mysterious, and deeply debated as the episode of Nebuchadnezzar's madness. As narrated in the book of Daniel, the king of Babylon, after a speech filled with pride before the city he had built, was struck by an extreme condition. He lost his reason, left human society, lived among the animals of the field, fed on grass, and allowed his hair and nails to grow uncontrollably. For 7 times, this monarch who once ruled the world lived like a beast. But the question that historians, theologians, and scholars of antiquity continue to ask remains unresolved. Did this really happen? Or is it a carefully constructed allegory, filled with symbolic layers that transcend literal biography? From a literal standpoint, some scholars suggest the king may have suffered from a psychiatric disorder known today as boanthropy, an extremely rare condition in which a person believes they are an animal, usually a cow or other herbivore, and begins to imitate its behavior. This modern medical hypothesis is often cited as a possible explanation for the described behavior. Nebuchadnezzar, in this deep state of delusion, might have left the palace, secluded himself in open fields, lived naked, silent, and fed on grass far from any trace of civilization. There are clinical parallels recorded in later centuries, and although it's impossible to confirm this disorder in antiquity with certainty, its plausibility lends weight to the idea that the episode may indeed have had a concrete physical and psychological component. Still, even if one accepts the possibility of a real disorder, the way the biblical text frames this event clearly points to a theological narrative. The term 7 times need not be interpreted literally as 7 years, although some interpreters do, but rather as a complete cycle, according to Hebrew numerology. The number 7 symbolizes totality, perfection, and fulfillment. This indicates that Nebuchadnezzar lived his state of humiliation for precisely as long as it took for his inner transformation to be complete. Thus, the narrative functions less as a biographical account and more as a parable of conversion. He did not merely go mad, he was broken. He did not just lose the throne, he was reconfigured as a human being. The symbolic power of the episode is amplified by its resemblance to myths from other cultures. Many ancient civilizations recorded stories of kings who lost their sanity or were temporarily removed from society by divine will. These narratives carried moral and spiritual lessons. Power corrupts, and limitless pride draws divine punishment. The temporary madness of the sovereign was a metaphor for the disconnection between the human world and the divine order. The king had to stop seeing himself as a god to finally govern as a man. Nebuchadnezzar fits perfectly into this archetype. He is the prototype of a ruler who must lose everything in order to understand the nature of true power. Whether literal event, psychological illness, theological metaphor, or prophetic composition, Nebuchadnezzar's madness plays a structural role in biblical narrative and historical imagination. It marks the definitive turning point in the king's story. We are no longer seeing the ruthless conqueror, nor the brilliant administrator or architect of Babylon's wonders. We are looking at a naked, fragile human being, in contact with the earth, with the rhythms of nature, reduced to instinct, stripped of speech and rational consciousness, until, lifting his eyes to the heavens, his sanity is restored, and more than that, his awareness is renewed. That final scene, the upward gaze to the heavens, is rich in symbolism. It is the gesture that reverses the entire trajectory of the king. The same man who once looked down upon his constructions, who surveyed the cities he had conquered, now looks at something above him. In doing so, he realizes he is not the center of the universe. Pride gives way to reverence, and with that inner shift, his identity is restored. But it is no longer the same Nebuchadnezzar. He returns to the throne, yes, but not to build more statues of himself. He returns to proclaim before his entire court, "Now I praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because all his works are true, and his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride." The king's madness, then, transcends the boundaries of diagnosis or historicity. It becomes a universal message. Even the most powerful are subject to downfall. Even those who build empires can be reduced to dust. Even those who rule over men must bow before what is eternal. And Nebuchadnezzar, King of Kings, learned this in the deepest and most irreversible way possible, with his body in the grass, his eyes toward heaven, and with the silence that only those who have lost everything are able to hear. After the long and symbolic period of madness, when Nebuchadnezzar found himself reduced to the most primitive state of human existence, stripped of reason and glory, living among animals and feeding on the herbs of the field, a decisive moment occurred. As narrated in the book of Daniel, chapter 4, His sanity was restored not by medical intervention, nor by the decree of priests, but through a simple act of awareness. When he lifted his eyes to heaven, the king acknowledged the existence of a power greater than his own. This gesture, both physical and spiritual, broke the cycle of arrogance and marked the beginning of the restoration of his identity. It was the final point of his fall, and the beginning of a new phase, no longer defined by the imposition of his authority over men, but by reverent admiration for the divine authority over all things. Nebuchadnezzar's restoration to the throne was, according to the biblical account, complete and immediate. His reason was returned, his dignity restored, and his counselors and nobles sought him out once again, returning the government to him with renewed respect. But the essential difference was that the man who returned to power was not the same as the one who had fallen. He no longer spoke of the glory of his works or exalted himself as the creator of Babylon's wonders. On the contrary, his first recorded words after the restoration are a song of praise. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the King of heaven, because all his works are true, and his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. This declaration, coming from a pagan king, echoes as a confession of faith before the eternal, and represents the highest point of his spiritual journey. From a political standpoint, it is remarkable that Nebuchadnezzar's restoration occurred without resistance or power struggles. In many empires, a prolonged episode of madness would have led to the king's deposition or replacement. But in Babylon, his absence was tolerated, his image preserved, and his return accepted with ease. This may be due to the cult of personality that Nebuchadnezzar had built over the decades, with his image inscribed on walls, temples, and monuments associated with divine protection and the prosperity of the empire. It may also reflect the reverent fear of his officials, who might have dreaded divine punishment for removing him. Or perhaps the impact of his transformation was so profound that upon reappearing, he was received as someone touched by something greater, a kind of priest-king purified through suffering. His reign after restoration was not marked by new colossal projects or grand military campaigns. It was a time of stability, quietude, and reflection. It is as though the king, now aware of the fragility of earthly power, chose to rule with humility, preserving the empire rather than expanding it, and sustaining order rather than building monuments to his own glory. This change in posture does not appear in administrative records or military chronicles, but it is etched in the way Nebuchadnezzar is remembered, not only as a ruthless conqueror, but as a man who passed through the furnace of pride and survived to tell what he had learned. Nebuchadnezzar's final testimony, recorded in simple and humble words, contrasts sharply with the weight of his previous trajectory. The same king who destroyed Jerusalem, who desecrated temples, who built towers reaching the heavens, who demanded worship of golden statues, now acknowledges that true dominion is beyond human reach. His reign, however grand, was merely a shadow before eternity. This awareness did not weaken him, it ennobled him. For in recognizing his own limitations, Nebuchadnezzar touched the only sovereignty that cannot be challenged, God's reign over all nations, times, and thrones. The restoration of Nebuchadnezzar's throne is not merely a return to power, it is a restoration of the soul. It is the image of a man brought down to the dust who loses his reason, who crawls like a beast, and who, upon looking upward, finds not destruction, but mercy. It is the story of a king who needed to lose everything in order to discover what truly matters, and in doing so, he not only regained his crown, he regained his humanity. At the end of his journey, Nebuchadnezzar left behind an empire, but he also left an eternal lesson. All human glory is dust before the majesty of the one who reigns forever. Among all the kings of the ancient world, few left a mark as visible, monumental, and symbolic as Nebuchadnezzar II. His legacy is not only found in sacred texts, war chronicles, or the spiritual echoes of Babylon, but also, and perhaps most vividly, in the stones, bricks, reliefs, and cyclopean structures that transformed a city between the Tigris and Euphrates into one of the most impressive wonders of antiquity. Nebuchadnezzar's architectural legacy is not merely about imperial aesthetics. It is a language of power, permanence, and dominion. Every wall, every gate, every throne room was designed to communicate a clear message. Here reigns a sovereign who commands not only peoples, but time itself. At the heart of his urban ambition stood the capital, Babylon, a city inherited from his father, Nabopolassar, still functional but far from its symbolic potential. Nebuchadnezzar turned it into the living stage of his reign. The city's restoration and expansion projects included massive walls, wide paved avenues, artificial canals for water control, restored ziggurats, enhanced temples, and of course, his monumental royal palace. Babylon's outer walls were doubled, with interspersed defensive towers and foundations reinforced with bitumen, stone, and cuneiform inscribed pressed bricks. It is said that the walls were wide enough for chariots to ride in both directions atop them. More than defense, these walls were symbols. The city would not merely withstand the enemy, it was impregnable. One of the most emblematic elements of Nebuchadnezzar's legacy was the Ishtar Gate, perhaps the most famous entrance in ancient history. Covered in deep blue glazed bricks, adorned with rows of lions, bulls, and dragons, sacred symbols associated with gods like Marduk and Adad, this gate was not merely functional, it was a rite of passage. Anyone entering Babylon through it felt they were stepping into another world. A reconstruction of this gate, discovered during German excavations in the early 20th century, now stands in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, one of the most vivid proofs of Babylonian architectural sophistication and splendor. Beyond the walls and gates, Nebuchadnezzar's palace was a structure of near mythic scale. Located near the Euphrates, it housed dozens of halls, ceremonial courtyards, audience chambers, hanging gardens, and corridors lined with reliefs and inscriptions glorifying the king and his deeds. The intensive use of glazed bricks, an innovation of the time, gave the palace a shine and color never before seen in Mesopotamian architecture. Nebuchadnezzar's name was engraved on thousands of these bricks, a calculated strategy to eternalize his physical and symbolic presence in every corner of the city. Another remarkable aspect of his legacy was the restructuring of the city's hydraulic system. Controlling the Euphrates waters was essential for both survival and Babylon's magnificence. The king ordered the construction of dikes, dams, navigable canals, and reservoirs, creating an irrigation network that nourished gardens, agricultural fields, and even residential areas and temples. This mastery over water was not merely technical, it was a symbolic extension of his dominion over nature, aligning the city with the ideal of cosmic order. It was as if the king had tamed not only peoples, but the elements themselves. The Etemenanki, the great ziggurat, is another jewel of Nebuchadnezzar's architectural legacy. Its reconstruction represented the attempt to restore the stairway between heaven and earth, a 7-story pyramidal structure around 90 meters high, dedicated to the god Marduk. This temple tower was the gravitational center of the city and possibly the historical model for the myth of the Tower of Babel. Its grandeur inspired reverence and awe, projecting the image of Babylon as the center of the world, guardian of the sacred and mirror of celestial order. The Asagila temple, adjacent to the ziggurat, was also extensively renovated by Nebuchadnezzar. He not only restored it as a place of worship, but also transformed it into an administrative and theological center. His inscriptions detail the care taken in every aspect of construction, the selection of materials, and the rituals of consecration. This temple was where the king would present himself annually before the statue of Marduk during the Akitu festival, to symbolically renew his authority. Thus, architecture was merged with ritual, governance, theology, and culture. Nebuchadnezzar's legacy is a rare blend of monumentality, sophistication, and political strategy. Nothing was built by accident. Each structure served multiple functions: practical, symbolic, religious, and propagandistic. The entire city was an imperial manifesto, and even today, in excavated ruins, bricks inscribed with his name, ancient maps, and archaeological reconstructions, one can still see the grand shadow of a king who desired more than power. He sought eternity. While the Cyclopean walls rose, the palaces shimmered with vitreous colors, and ceremonial gates opened for sacred processions, the city of Babylon pulsed with the life of tens of thousands of people who, day after day, gave form to the heart of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The grandeur of Nebuchadnezzar's reign was not composed solely of his military feats or monuments, but of the silent richness of daily life. Through archaeological records, administrative inscriptions, and contemporary chronicles, we can reconstruct a vibrant Babylon, socially complex, diverse, and intensely alive. A metropolis where merchants, scribes, priests, artisans, soldiers, farmers, enslaved people and foreigners all revolved around a king who seemed to touch the divine. The city was divided into neighborhoods and functional zones. There were dense residential areas, open markets, wide avenues for processions, and narrow alleys where common citizens moved. The Euphrates ran through Babylon like a vital artery, with bridges connecting its two banks. Boats carried grain, textiles, wine, fruit, ceramics, and papyri. In the artisans' homes, furnaces smoked all day, shaping ceramics, glassware, bronze, and gold objects. In the plazas, scribes sat with clay tablets, ready to record contracts, wills, sales, and oracles. At the temple entrances, priests sacrificed animals and tended the gods' statues through daily rituals, timed by celestial bodies. It was a ritualistic and functional city where every gesture, from selling a fish to inaugurating a temple, was part of a higher order. Babylonian society under Nebuchadnezzar was stratified. At the top were nobles, many directly linked to the royal family, palace administration, or military elite. Just below were the priests, who held tremendous religious, political, and economic influence. Temples were not merely places of worship. They were centers of taxation, loans, landholding, and justice. Next came the scribes and administrative officials, responsible for maintaining the records that organized the empire. These professionals formed a respected literate elite. At the base were free artisans, merchants, and farmers who paid taxes, produced food, and kept the city's economy moving. Beneath them were enslaved workers, often war captives or debtors, employed in public works, domestic service, and temple labor. Housing reflected this hierarchy. Nobles lived in large homes with inner courtyards, cool rooms, and storage areas for food, wine, and valuables. Free laborers and farmers lived in smaller, often adjoining homes made of sun-dried mud bricks. Still, most had access to running water via public canals and wells. Bathing and hygiene were important cultural elements. The presence of public latrines, drainage systems, and even sanitation laws shows that Babylon was far ahead of its time in civic organization. Daily life was also shaped by the religious and astrological calendar. Babylonians lived under the guidance of gods and stars. Each day of the week had divine associations. Lunar phases marked the beginning of feasts and fasts. Priest astronomers observed the heavens, recording eclipses, conjunctions, and comets, events seen as omens for the king and people. Babylonian astrology influenced political decisions, marriages, wars, and commerce. People were accustomed to a world where the divine manifested in every shadow, star, or illness. Medicine blended empirical knowledge with ritual. Amulets, prayers, purifying baths, and herbal remedies were used together to treat diseases. Life in Babylon was also full of sounds, smells, and colors. In the plazas, musicians played harps, flutes, and drums. Vendors loudly called to customers. Perfumes wafted from oil and essence shops. Fresh fruits like dates, figs, pomegranates, and grapes were sold in wicker baskets. Bread was the dietary staple, alongside barley beer and dishes of lentils, onions, and lamb. Clothing varied by class. Nobles wore colorful linen tunics with embroidery and jewelry, while workers wore simpler garments of wool or hemp. Fashion followed the seasons, religious customs, and social distinctions. Even foreigners, such as the Hebrews taken into exile, found their place in Babylon's complex machine. Some became temple servants, others worked on public projects or in trade. Many preserved their traditions and were respected for their skills. Religious freedom existed to a relative degree, as long as it didn't threaten imperial order. Entire neighborhoods may have consisted of foreign communities who discreetly celebrated their festivals and maintained their languages. Though imperial, Babylon was not ethnically homogeneous. It was a true multicultural metropolis where coexistence, vigilance, and ritualized interaction sustained cohesion. Under Nebuchadnezzar, living in Babylon meant experiencing a profoundly urban, organized, and sacred life. Every citizen, from the highest noble to the humblest servant, knew they were part of a cosmos structured by human and divine law. And even if the king remained distant, in his palace of golden bricks, his presence was felt in every gate, every coin, every proclamation etched into the city's walls. The city was him. and he, through it, became eternal. Long before telescopes or satellites crossed the skies, long before astronomical equations or charts existed, there were men in Babylon who silently climbed the temple terraces and towers each night to contemplate the heavens. These were the priest astronomers, known as Baru or Tupsharu Enuma Anu Enlil, specialists tasked with deciphering the sky as if it were a living scripture of the gods. Under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, this knowledge reached a new level of systematization and reverence. Babylonian astrology was not a mere pastime or popular superstition, it was sacred science, a central element in imperial administration and a direct instrument of communication with the divine. Observing the sky was, in essence, interpreting the future of kings and nations, and Babylon, under his leadership, became the celestial laboratory of antiquity. The records of this science were meticulously inscribed on clay tablets in cuneiform, many of which have survived to this day. These tablets, compiled into collections like the renowned Enuma Anu Enlil, contained hundreds of astronomical omens based on centuries of observations. A lunar eclipse, an omen of king's downfall, a conjunction between Mars and Venus, a sign of war, or a bountiful harvest, depending on the position. Each celestial event was linked to earthly consequences. And these omens were not applied arbitrarily. There was a logic, a tradition, a discipline. The priests observed, recorded, compared with previous cases, and wrote detailed reports for the palace. These reports shaped royal decisions, from military campaigns to administrative reforms. The temples functioned as research centers. In particular, the Esagila temple, dedicated to Marduk, housed scribes, mathematicians, healers, and sky watchers. From the top of the Etemenanki ziggurat, astronomers had a privileged view of the horizon, essential for lunar and planetary observations. Basic instruments like stakes, measuring rods, and numeric tables were used to calculate the length of months, predict eclipses, and track the cycles of the 5 visible planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. This accumulated knowledge produced the first stable lunar calendars, with months adjusted to celestial movements and religious festivals aligned to these patterns. Most extraordinary is that Babylonian astrology extended beyond cult practices. It was applied in medicine, agriculture, politics, and even law. The birth of a child was analyzed based on the position of the stars. Decisions about planting and harvesting followed celestial signs. Even court judgments could be preceded by consultations with omens. It was not merely about personal forecasts like modern horoscopes, but rather a cosmic vision of collective destiny. The king, as the empire's supreme figure, was the primary focus of these predictions. Priests monitored the skies for signs about his health, longevity, alliances, and throne security. Records show that Nebuchadnezzar deeply respected these practices. Many of his religious and military decisions were subordinated to the messages received from the stars. This knowledge was both conservative and innovative. Conservative because it relied on an ancient tradition dating back to Sumerian times. Innovative because Babylonian scribes developed astonishing mathematical techniques. They were the first to use a positional number system based on 60, the same we use today to measure minutes and seconds. This allowed them to perform complex astronomical calculations, such as predicting the return of eclipses using the Saros cycle. These advances would later be studied by Greek scholars like Hipparchus and Ptolemy. Babylonian astrology, therefore, did not die with the empire. It was inherited, translated, reinterpreted, and carried forward into the Hellenistic, Islamic, and eventually European worlds. From a religious perspective, observing the stars was not a defiance of divine will, but a faithful obedience. The planets were seen as wandering deities. The moon, called Sin, and the sun, called Shamash, were treated as living beings. Venus was the goddess Ishtar, Mars was Nergal, and Saturn was Ninurta. Each planet had its personality, temperament, control over specific events, and direct connections to the days of the week and parts of the human body. Thus, Babylonian astrology was also a codified mythology, the sky as a divine theater, where gods danced invisible signs for those who could read their language. The most fascinating aspect is realizing that even in such a deeply religious civilization, the observation of the heavens was carried out with scientific rigor. Measurements were recorded daily with precise dates, corrections, cross-references, and continuous updates to the tables. Astrology for the Babylonians was a harmonious fusion of faith and reason, and this, more than any building or military conquest, represents one of Babylon's most enduring legacies, the idea that the cosmos can be understood, that time follows an observable cycle, and that even gods in their glory allow themselves to be known by those who carefully watch the sky. In Nebuchadnezzar's empire, writing was not merely an administrative tool, it was a bridge between men and gods, between the present and the past, between the earthly and the eternal. Babylon was a civilization that etched its memory onto clay. Every official act, every royal decree, every commercial contract, every sacred prayer was meticulously inscribed on moist clay tablets using a reed stylus that left wedge-shaped marks. Hence the name cuneiform. These seemingly fragile clay artifacts have withstood the test of time far better than parchment or papyrus. They are the backbone of what we know about the intellectual, religious, and artistic life of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon's literate culture was vast, complex, and institutionalized. From early childhood, the sons of scribes were sent to the tablet houses, educational institutions where they learned to read and write cuneiform signs, copy ancient literary texts, and perform mathematical calculations. The formation of a scribe was long and demanding, often taking decades. The most skilled were absorbed by temples, palaces, or judicial institutions. Their duties extended far beyond mere record-keeping. They interpreted dreams, composed prayers, organized calendars, codified laws, calculated taxes, and transmitted religious traditions. They were guardians of knowledge, and their social prestige reflected that role. Cuneiform writing was used in two main languages: Sumerian, employed as a liturgical and scholarly language, and Akkadian, the standard language for administration and daily communication. Babylonian scribes copied ancient texts with almost sacred reverence. Works such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, hymns to Marduk, medical manuals, astrological treatises, mathematical tables, and legal formulas were repeatedly replicated, studied, and annotated. It was not uncommon for a single tablet to combine poetry and science, mythology, and calculation. The modern compartmentalization of knowledge did not exist in Babylon. Everything belonged to a unified, symbolic, and functional universe. Visual art also flourished intensely under Nebuchadnezzar's reign. The reliefs decorating gates, palaces, and temples depicted scenes of offerings, processions, battles, and divine myths. The glazed bricks used in the Ishtar Gate, for example, featured symbolic animals, lions, serpent dragons, mushhush, bulls, that were not merely decorative elements, but embodiments of divine power. These creatures served as guardians, warding off chaos and protecting the cosmic order represented by the king. The colors used on the bricks, deep blue, gold, white, and black, also held ritual meanings. The blue symbolized the sacred sky, gold, divine light, white, ritual purity. Smaller sculptures, cylinder seals, jewelry, and utensils were also part of Babylon's aesthetic world. Cylinder seals, used to authenticate documents or secure letters with string and clay, were miniature masterpieces carved with meticulous precision. They depicted scenes of worship, hunting, sacrifice, marriage, or cosmogonic myths. These seals combined utility and artistry, conveying identity, status, and even personal beliefs. In tombs and homes, archaeologists have found artifacts made of copper, gold, lapis lazuli, and semi-precious stones, materials that reached Babylon through trade routes stretching to India, Africa, and the Mediterranean. Music, though less materially preserved, was equally vital. Instruments such as harps, flutes, lyres, and drums were used in religious ceremonies, public festivals, and healing rituals. Wall paintings and reliefs show musicians and dancers accompanying priests during sunrise rituals or annual festivals. Sound, like image and word, was part of sacred expression. Melody was a form of praise, supplication, and purification. It was believed that certain tones could please the gods or repel demons. Many priests had to master not only the written prayers, but also their rhythmic and melodic recitation. Nebuchadnezzar himself appears in various inscriptions, praising the importance of preserving writing and the arts. On many tablets he is described as the restorer of ancient writings, he who honors the gods with enduring words, or he who revives the wisdom of the ancestors. He understood that an empire was not built solely on armies or bricks, but on memory, and this memory was crafted with art, sound, and script. His restoration of temples included the reinstallation of sacred steles, forgotten inscriptions, and ritual objects from previous centuries. His Babylon was both a vanguard and a living archaeology. Thus, when we look at Nebuchadnezzar's cultural legacy, we see more than empires and walls. We see a civilization that wrote, sang, painted, and preserved its world with delicacy and reverence. A people who believed that by engraving a tablet, they were forging a pact with eternity. And indeed, these tablets, broken, buried, rediscovered, continue to speak. They speak of kings, poets, dreamers. They speak of a time when words shaped the world, and in every cuneiform symbol still echoes the breath of a city that dreamed of the infinite. After the death of Nebuchadnezzar, around the year 562 before Christ, the splendor of Babylon slowly began to unravel under the weight of political instability, internal ambitions, and external threats. The city still boasted imposing walls, sacred temples, and palaces adorned with glazed bricks, but the vital force that had animated this imperial body, the charismatic and centralized leadership of its king, no longer existed. The throne, once a symbol of unity and cosmic order, became the object of dispute among weak and unpopular successors. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which had reached its peak under Nebuchadnezzar, became a grand edifice with foundations rotting from within. Babylon, once the dominator of kings and kingdoms, now struggled to conquer its own ghosts. Shortly after the king's death, his son Amel-Marduk, also known as Evil Merodach, assumed the throne, but his reign was brief and troubled. Historical sources, such as Berossus and later documents, describe him as a careless ruler, or unpopular among the priests and palace elites. He was assassinated after only 2 years by Neriglissar, a general who had married one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters. Neriglissar tried to maintain the empire's prestige with military campaigns and public works, but his early death plunged the throne into even greater instability. His son, Labashi-Marduk, a child, reigned for only a few months before being deposed, perhaps assassinated in a palace conspiracy. These successive coups eroded the very stability that had upheld Babylon's power for decades. The next ruler to assume the throne with any degree of control was Nabonidus, an enigmatic figure devoted to Sin, the moon god. He broke with the tradition of centralized worship of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, which created tension with the priests and the people. Instead of ruling from the capital, Nabonidus spent years away in Tama, an oasis city in Arabia, leaving his son Belshazzar as co-regent. This prolonged absence from the court and his disregard for Babylonian religious customs created a vacuum of authority. Babylon, without a present king and amid the fragmentation of its elite, became vulnerable, not just militarily, but spiritually. The empire that had once seen itself as the center of the universe was now isolated, with its cohesion disintegrating from within. Meanwhile, in the east, a new power was rising with vigor and cunning. The Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great. With a broad strategic vision and a policy of religious tolerance, Cyrus knew how to exploit Babylon's internal weaknesses. In 539 before Christ, without the need for a destructive siege, the Persian troops entered the city almost without resistance. The fall of Babylon was as silent as it was symbolic. The city that had once defied the heavens now opened its gates to a foreign conqueror without a fight. According to the Nabonidus Chronicle, Cyrus was welcomed as a liberator. He restored temples, returned idols, and respected local customs, in sharp contrast to Babylon's last rulers. The Persian conquest marked the end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, but it did not immediately erase its legacy. Babylon remained an important city under Persian rule, later under Alexander the Great, and even into the early centuries of the Hellenistic era. But it was no longer the capital of a world. It no longer spoke with the voice of the gods. Its greatness became a distant echo, its temples emptied, its ziggurats abandoned, its scribes dispersed. The waters of the Euphrates, which once reflected the blue brilliance of the Ishtar Gate, now passed silently through empty streets, silent witnesses to what had once been the most radiant metropolis on earth. Nebuchadnezzar's legacy though overshadowed by time and the empires that followed, never fully disappeared. His constructions influenced ancient architecture. His name was preserved in Hebrew, Greek, Persian, and Arabic texts. His figure inspired stories of power, downfall, and redemption, and his city continued to live on in the dreams of archaeologists, poets, and prophets. When, centuries later, the sands of Mesopotamia began to be excavated, and the first bricks inscribed with his name came to light, it was as if Babylon was awakening from a millennial sleep, a reminder that even the most powerful civilizations are subject to the cycle of time. They rise, shine, fall, but they leave traces, and those traces, written in clay and stone and in memory, still speak to us. Far beyond the walls of Babylon and the cuneiform tablets buried under the dust of Mesopotamia, Nebuchadnezzar found a second life, a symbolic, mythical existence, reinterpreted across the centuries, in the pages of the Hebrew Bible, especially in the book of Daniel. There, he is not merely a powerful king, but a character charged with deep spiritual meaning. His journey becomes a living metaphor for human pride, the inevitable fall before the divine, and the possibility of redemption. The name Nebuchadnezzar then comes to inhabit not only historical records, but also the religious imagination of Jews, Christians, and even Muslims. His image expands, and his figure gains contours that go beyond any archaeological portrait. He becomes a living warning, a spiritual lesson, a mirror of the human drama between arrogance and humility. In the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar is introduced as the king who plunders Jerusalem, profanes the temple, and takes captive the young Hebrews, among them Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These young men, educated in Babylonian science, are trained to serve at court. But the text makes one thing clear from the start. Though Nebuchadnezzar holds material power, true wisdom and authority come from the God of heaven. The episode of the statue dream in chapter 2 marks the beginning of this symbolic conflict. The king dreams of a terrifying statue made of different metals: gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay. Only Daniel can interpret it, revealing that each part represents an empire, and that all of them, including Nebuchadnezzar's, will be destroyed by a stone representing God's eternal kingdom. Though the king is awed, his vanity soon leads him to build a statue of solid gold, demanding total worship. The response of the three Hebrew youths, who refuse to bow and are thrown into a blazing furnace, becomes one of the most powerful narratives of faith, courage, and divine intervention in the biblical tradition. But the most symbolic moment in Nebuchadnezzar's story comes in chapter 4. There the king himself narrates his testimony. He recounts a second dream, in which a great tree stretches to the heavens and shelters all creation, but is cut down by divine command, leaving only the root bound in iron. Daniel interprets it. The tree is Nebuchadnezzar himself. Because of his pride, he will be stripped of his reason, live among animals, eat grass like cattle, and be drenched by the dew of heaven until he acknowledges that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men. The text describes the king's transformation into a kind of beast, a figure between human and animal. This metamorphosis represents more than punishment. It symbolizes the spiritual degradation of one who denies divine sovereignty, but it also reveals the possibility of redemption. After 7 times, a symbolic number, Nebuchadnezzar lifts his eyes to heaven, recognizes God's dominion, and his sanity is restored. He returns to rule, but now as a transformed man. The monarch who once likened himself to the gods now praises the one true God, declaring, "All his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride." The book of Daniel thus uses the figure of Nebuchadnezzar as an archetype of the proud king who must be broken to understand the true purpose of authority. He represents human empire at its peak, splendid, technical, wise, but also arrogant and blind. At the same time, he becomes a symbol of hope, for he is the only foreign king in Scripture who, after being humbled by God, genuinely converts. Unlike pharaohs or emperors, Nebuchadnezzar ends his narrative in praise. This inversion is profound. It teaches that no throne stands above heaven, but also that no man is beyond the reach of divine mercy. This symbolic representation of the Babylonian king also echoes in apocalyptic literature. The very concept of the beast, which appears more explicitly in the book of Revelation, has its roots in the later chapters of Daniel. where successive empires are depicted as grotesque animals: a winged leopard, a fanged bear, a lion with clipped wings. These images are not mere political allegories, they are spiritual warnings. Nebuchadnezzar, by becoming like an animal, foreshadows this symbolism. Kingdoms that forget God and place themselves above good and evil inevitably lose their humanity. But unlike the apocalyptic beasts, Nebuchadnezzar returns to being a man, and that return sets him apart. He is not a symbol of absolute evil. He is a symbol of human vanity that can be healed. The echo of Nebuchadnezzar continues to resonate in sermons, theological treatises, and biblical commentaries throughout the centuries. To many, he is the image of imperial pride. To others, he is the proof that even the mightiest of kings can recognize their smallness before the Creator. His story transcends time because it is not just about Babylon. It is about the human heart. The heart that builds empires but must sometimes be reminded, through suffering, that all human glory is like chaff in the wind, and that only what is founded on truth, justice, and humility before God endures. Over the centuries, the figure of Nebuchadnezzar has not only crossed geographical and cultural boundaries, but has also become entangled in a web of legends, historical misunderstandings, theological disputes, and symbolic interpretations that have both enriched and at times distorted how we perceive this king of Babylon. More than a distant character, he has become a multifaceted mirror onto which different traditions have projected their fears, reverence, and lessons. These curiosities reveal how even after death, a king can continue to wield influence, not through armies or monuments, but through meaning. One of the most debated questions among scholars and believers alike is whether Nebuchadnezzar truly converted to the God of Israel. Chapter 4 of the book of Daniel suggests that he did, at least in terms of acknowledging divine sovereignty, but this raises many questions. Was that final praise merely rhetorical, or did it reflect a true change of heart? The text says he resumed his reign after 7 periods of madness, but does not mention whether his political or religious practices changed. The absence of a formal conversion or public acts of exclusive faith in the Hebrew God has sparked intense theological debate. For some Christian theologians, such as Augustine, this conversion represents a glimpse of divine grace working even outside the chosen people. For others, it was merely an act driven by fear, without lasting inner transformation. Curiously, there are historical cuneiform records that mention Nebuchadnezzar, but none of them report the episode of madness or his isolation among animals. This doesn't necessarily mean the event was fictitious, but if it did happen, it was likely omitted from official chronicles, a common practice in ancient regimes that sought to conceal the king's weaknesses. On the other hand, some modern scholars suggest that the beast transformation episode might be a political metaphor, a literary device meant to criticize despotism or the arrogance of foreign kings. Others propose that the king may have actually suffered from a real psychological disorder, such as clinical lycanthropy or boanthropy, conditions in which a person believes themselves to be an animal. Could this be the first psychiatric case in history? The question remains open. Another curiosity lies in the king's name, which appears in various spellings throughout history. In Hebrew, he is called Nebuchadnezzar or Nebuchadrezzar. In Greek, Nabuchodonosor. In Arabic, Buktnasar. These variations have caused confusion in ancient manuscripts and biblical translations. In some apocryphal texts and Islamic narratives, Nebuchadnezzar is confused with other kings or portrayed as a demonic figure, responsible not only for the destruction of Jerusalem, but also for broader persecutions of prophets. The Quran does not mention his name directly, but later Islamic tradition associates him with the tyrant king who destroyed the temple, a figure often merged with other Babylonian conquerors. In later Jewish traditions, such as the Talmud, Nebuchadnezzar appears as a terrifying yet sometimes ridiculed character. Some passages describe him with crude habits or portray him being punished by God in ironic ways. In certain rabbinic stories, he is depicted as someone who partially acknowledges God, but only superficially. Other legends claim that he repented, but was not accepted due to the severity of his sins. These ambiguities reflect the discomfort of dealing with an enemy who, despite destroying the temple, also recognized the true God. What should be done with such a figure? Tradition wavers between condemning him as a tyrant and seeing him as an example of improbable conversion. Among archaeologists, another curiosity involves the so-called Nebuchadnezzar bricks. Hundreds of thousands of bricks found in Babylon's ruins bear his inscribed name. In the past, some tourists even took these bricks as souvenirs. This sparked a wave of Babylonian artifact collecting throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, with European and American museums competing for relics stamped with the king's name. These bricks remain one of the strongest physical proofs of his accomplishments. In historical terms, no other ancient king had his name printed so many times in his own constructions. It was as if he wished to sign eternity itself, and in a way, he succeeded. Finally, a frequently overlooked detail. The name Nebuchadnezzar has been preserved across cultures and even modern art. In music, he inspired orchestral works and operas. In literature, he became a character in historical and mystical novels. And in cinema, his name was given to Morpheus's ship in The Matrix, a symbolic reference to awakening consciousness and the fall of human pride. These echoes show that the king of Babylon is no longer just a biblical character or archaeological figure. He has become a symbol of power that soars too high, but also of the ability to recognize one's smallness in the face of mystery. For centuries, ancient Babylon lay dormant beneath the sands of what is now Iraq, as if time itself had sealed its brick gates with silence and oblivion. The city that was once the center of the world, home to Nebuchadnezzar, his ziggurats, palaces, and the hanging gardens, fell into Western imagination as legend, as a biblical symbol, as a faint echo of splendor and sin. But in the 19th century, with the rise of archaeological excavations and the European fascination with the civilizations of the Near East, Babylon began to awaken from its long slumber, and what emerged from the earth was as astonishing as ancient texts had promised: walls wide enough for 2 chariots, ceremonial gates covered in cobalt blue lions, and bricks still bearing, in cuneiform script, the name of its greatest builder, Nebuchadnezzar II. The first systematic expedition to Babylon was led by German archaeologists at the end of the 19th century, under Robert Koldewey. From 1899 to 1917, they excavated a vast portion of the ancient city, accurately identifying structures that had previously been known only from written sources. Among the most impressive discoveries was the monumental Ishtar Gate, adorned with lions, bulls, and mythical dragons in glazed blue and golden ceramics, and the processional way used in major religious ceremonies. The gate was dismantled piece by piece and reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, where it remains today as one of the most iconic archaeological artifacts in the world. Every brick, every relief confirmed not only the city's existence, but the scale of Nebuchadnezzar's urban vision. Archaeologists also uncovered remains of the Etemenanke ziggurat, often identified as the historical inspiration for the Tower of Babel. This colossal construction, with its square base and multiple levels, would have been one of the largest religious structures of antiquity. Although in ruins, its foundations revealed its monumental scale. Several cuneiform documents were also discovered, including royal inscriptions by Nebuchadnezzar, in which he details his construction works, restored temples, and devotion to the god Marduk. In these texts, he appears as a zealous, almost priestly king, who sees his reign as an extension of divine will. These tablets, now housed in museums around the world, form an invaluable archive of Babylon's politics, religion, engineering, and worldview during the 6th century before Christ. The rediscovery of Babylon also sparked political fascination. In the 20th century, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein attempted to revive Nebuchadnezzar's legacy by rebuilding parts of the ruins with modern bricks stamped with his own name, placed alongside the ancient ones. The move was criticized by archaeologists but illustrates the ongoing symbolic power of Nebuchadnezzar. For many Iraqis, he was not merely a historical figure, he was a national icon, representing a time when their land was the heart of human civilization. The mix of authentic ruins and ideological reconstructions, however, generated tension between scientific preservation and modern propaganda. Even today, the ruins of Babylon, near the city of Hilla, remain at the center of disputes over conservation, tourism, and identity. In 2019, UNESCO officially recognized Babylon as a World Heritage Site, reaffirming its universal value, but preserving the site remains challenging due to armed conflict, illegal excavations, and climate change. Despite this, researchers continue to excavate and digitize what remains of the city. Modern technology allows for three-dimensional reconstructions, automatic translation of inscriptions, and cross-referencing data across global collections. Today it is possible to walk virtually through the streets of Babylon, recognize its gates, and imagine what it would be like to live under Nebuchadnezzar's watchful eye. Every newly discovered artifact, be it a clay seal, a coin, or a temple fragment, helps restore the image of a civilization once thought lost. Thus, Nebuchadnezzar's legacy does not rest solely in religious texts or museum halls. It lives in the symbols he forged, in the architecture he dared to raise, in the writing that preserved his voice. It also lives in the ongoing dialogue between faith and history, between myth and document. His Babylon was both a real city and an eternal symbol, a city of stars and astrology, of gold and war, of towers and collapse. As we excavate Babylon, we also dig into our own limits, what makes us great and what brings us down. And perhaps that is Nebuchadnezzar's truest legacy, a call to reflect on power, memory, and the passage of time. Across the vastness of human memory, there are figures who vanish alongside their kingdoms, buried beneath layers of silence and oblivion. But there are also those who, even after millennia, continue to inhabit our books, our prayers, our ruins, and our questions. Nebuchadnezzar is one of them. He was not just the king of Babylon. He was a bridge between worlds, between the visible and the invisible, between archaeology and spirituality, between the earthly empire and the realms of the imagination. His eternity was not forged only in bricks and cuneiform inscriptions. It was written into the heart of three major religious traditions, reinterpreted by poets and theologians, reconstructed by archaeologists, and remembered by all who, when gazing into the past, try to understand what makes a civilization unforgettable. Historically, Nebuchadnezzar is the archetype of the great builder. No other Mesopotamian monarch left such an extensive record of public works, temple restorations, fortifications, and urban planning. His Babylon was a cosmic city, meticulously designed to reflect celestial order. It is no coincidence that the Temple of Marduk, the E-Sagila, and the Etemenanki Tower were constructed as axes between heaven and earth, symbolic bridges between the world of men and the world of the gods. For Nebuchadnezzar, ruling was not merely administration, it was the act of ordering the universe. This vision of the king as a representative of cosmic order imbues his legacy with a sacredness that transcends politics. His decrees, carved into tablets, still echo today in languages deciphered only recently, yet already influential to empires and entire religions. In the Jewish tradition, Nebuchadnezzar holds an ambiguous place. He is at once the destroyer of Solomon's temple and the instrument of divine will, an enemy fulfilling an unavoidable mission. A tyrant who paradoxically becomes a figure of redemption in the book of Daniel. This tension between oppressor and penitent makes him particularly fascinating. For the Hebrew prophets, he is the rod of God's anger, and his downfall serves as a warning to all nations. But his journey through pride, madness, and humiliation becomes a spiritual example. The most powerful of men can be brought low by the invisible hand of God. And from that low place, he can lift his eyes to the heavens and acknowledge his dependence on the Creator. In Christianity, this figure takes on even more symbolic meaning. The statue of metals dreamed by Nebuchadnezzar becomes an eschatological key. Each metal represents a phase of human history, culminating in God's eternal kingdom, symbolized by a stone that shatters all else and becomes a mountain. The king's dream, interpreted by Daniel, is no longer merely a personal episode. It becomes a universal prophecy. Nebuchadnezzar unknowingly becomes a voice for revelation. Even his transformation into a beast, a figure of humiliation, echoes in the book of Revelation, where empires are portrayed as monsters. His life is read as allegory, the pride of earthly kingdoms that without fear of God turn into beasts, but with repentance they may regain their humanity. In the Islamic world, though not mentioned directly in the Quran, Nebuchadnezzar is remembered in later commentaries and traditions as the king who destroyed Jerusalem. In some interpretations, he is associated with injustice and tyranny, In others, he is seen as a just punishment sent by God upon those who strayed from the truth. The figure remains alive, even when transformed. He is a reminder of power, but also of the fleeting nature of all human rule. In popular culture, Nebuchadnezzar appears in fragmented and symbolic ways. His name echoes in fiction, music, film, and even conspiracy theories. Morpheus's ship in The Matrix, carrying the hope of human liberation, is named Nebuchadnezzar, a clear reference to the king who dreamed of the end of empires. In Verdi's opera Nabucco, his story is reimagined as lyrical drama, and the famous chorus of the Hebrew slaves turns Babylon into a stage of nostalgia, oppression, and hope. Each new appearance reinterprets, renews, and perpetuates the name of a king who lived more than 2,500 years ago. That is eternity, not merely to be remembered, but to be retold. And perhaps, in the end, what Nebuchadnezzar symbolizes is the very human condition in the face of history. He reminds us that no power is absolute, no glory eternal, and that even the mightiest of kings can lose his mind when he forgets his origin. But he also reminds us that there is return, that there is wisdom in recognizing smallness, that there is greatness in bowing to mystery. His story, part fact, part faith, part myth, is a continuous lesson, a lesson written in bricks and in prayers, in texts and in dreams. And as long as his city is remembered, as long as his name is spoken, as long as his pride is studied and his fall retold, Nebuchadnezzar will remain among us, not as a ghost, but as a mirror of what we are and what we still have to learn.